No one expected that the inheritance announcement would change everything. For Jessica, the days of struggle and pain seemed endless, until a single revelation turned her life into a whirlwind of secrets and impossible choices. Her father's death left a void that no amount of money could fill, but what no one knew was that he had left far more than material wealth. As the voices at school grew more vicious and the pressure of being strong for her younger sister mounted, a shocking truth awaited, one that could threaten to tear apart the remaining bonds. Between pain and hope, Jessica now faces a decision. What is worth more, the memories of a simple life or the weight of an unexpected legacy? When everything seems at stake, how far would you go to save what matters most? The sound of distant voices echoed through the bustling school hallway, blending with the rustle of papers and the sharp squeak of sneakers on the polished floor. It was an ordinary day for most, but for Jessica, it was another battle she had to survive. At only 17 years old, she had learned to navigate the world with caution, her worn backpack slung over one shoulder. The faded fabric, a silent testament to the struggles she faced. As she approached her classroom, the noise grew louder, filled with the familiar chatter of students. Jessica took a deep breath before stepping through the door, her eyes darting to the back where a group of students already cast glances her way. She had always known she was different. Her clothes were older, her shoes too tight. She had no phone to brag about, no fancy gadgets to flaunt. And in a world where appearances mattered, Jessica felt like she was on the outside, looking in. "Jessica," a voice called out. It was Rachel, one of the popular girls, her voice laced with false sweetness. "Is that the same backpack from last year, or the year before that?" Laughter rippled through the room. Jessica forced a smile, hiding the sting of the remark. She knew better than to react, but it didn't make the words hurt any less. She shuffled to her seat, eyes downcast, pretending not to hear the whispers that followed her. The teacher, Mr. Stevens, walked in just as the teasing escalated. "All right, class, settle down," he called, his deep voice commanding attention. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, a stack of papers in hand. "Today, we're going to talk about an important moment in history, something that changed the world as we know it. Can anyone tell me about the fall of the Berlin Wall?" Hands shot up around Jessica, but her mind was elsewhere. She stared at her desk, the peeling paint on the corner capturing her attention more than the lesson. Thoughts of her father crept in. He had always told her that no matter how hard things got, they would make it through. "We don't need money to be happy," he'd say, his warm smile never faltering. Jessica believed him, even on days when there wasn't enough food or when the bills piled up. But lately, something had changed. Her father had been coughing more, moving slower. There were nights when she'd hear him stifling his pain behind closed doors, thinking she was asleep. And though he tried to hide it, Jessica knew. She knew something was wrong. "Jessica," Mr. Stevens' voice broke through her thoughts. Startled, she looked up, realizing the class was staring at her. Sorry, Mr. Stevens, could you repeat the question?" "The Berlin Wall, Jessica. What do you know about it?" Jessica racked her brain, trying to pull together fragments of history lessons. It was a wall in Germany, right, that divided the country. Mr. Stevens nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Yes, and what was its significance?" She hesitated, but then the answer came. "It was a symbol of division, but when it fell, it meant that people could be united again." "Exactly," Mr. Stevens smiled. "The fall of the Berlin Wall was about breaking down barriers, both physical and ideological. It reminds us that even the toughest walls can come down." Jessica nodded, the lessons sinking in. She wished the walls in her life could crumble just as easily. Barriers of poverty, of social exclusion, and now the looming fear of losing her father. But unlike the Berlin Wall, her challenges felt permanent. As the lesson continued, Jessica felt a slight tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Rachel, her smile mocking. "Hey, Harvard, Rachel whispered, referring to the prestigious university as a cruel joke. Maybe you can use that backpack as a museum piece one day. Jessica swallowed the retort that bubbled in her chest. She wouldn't give Rachel the satisfaction of knowing she was hurt. Instead, she turned back to her notebook, scribbling mindlessly in the margins. The day would end soon, and she'd be free from the taunts, at least until tomorrow. But what Rachel didn't know, what none of them knew, was that despite everything, Jessica had a secret weapon. Her father. He might not have been rich or influential, but he was her rock. Every night, he'd sit with her at the kitchen table, helping her with homework, listening to her worries. He was her anchor in a world that often felt like it was spiraling out of control. After school, Jessica hurried home, her heart heavy with the weight of the day. As she walked through the small neighborhood, she passed by a group of kids laughing and playing with brand new bikes. She lowered her head, quickening her pace. When she finally reached the small, run-down apartment, the door creaked open to reveal her father, sitting on the couch, coughing softly into a tissue. "Hey, sweetheart," he greeted her, his voice tired but warm. Jessica smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling?" He waved her off. "Same as always. You know me, tough as nails." But Jessica wasn't so sure anymore. The sight of him, frail and exhausted, sent a pang through her chest. She dropped her backpack by the door and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jess," he whispered, running a hand through her hair. "You're going to do great things. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "I just want things to get better, Dad," she replied, her voice barely audible. He sighed, pulling her closer. "They will, I promise." But even as he said it, Jessica could feel the uncertainty in his words. The truth was, neither of them knew what the future held. But for now, they had each other, and for Jessica, that was enough. The next morning, Jessica walked into school with a sense of dread that had become all too familiar. Her father's words of encouragement echoed in her mind, but they felt distant as she stepped into the classroom, where the noise of morning chatter buzzed like static. Her seat was near the window, and as she made her way to it, she felt the familiar eyes of Rachel and her group watching. Jessica kept her head down, focused on reaching her desk without incident. "Good morning, class," Mr. Stevens called out as he entered the room, his voice instantly commanding attention. He carried his usual stack of papers and a look of purpose. Jessica admired how he could control the room with just a few words. As the students settled, Mr. Stevens leaned against his desk and smiled. "All right, I've got a special topic today. We're going to talk about a moment that changed the world. Can anyone tell me what happened on November 9th, 1989? A few students glanced around, unsure. Jessica knew the answer, but kept quiet. She wasn't the kind of student who raised her hand unless directly asked. One of the boys in the back, Brian, spoke up. "Is that when the Berlin Wall came down?" Mr. Stevens nodded, his smile widening. "Exactly, the Berlin Wall. But do you know why that's important?" Brian shrugged. "Something about ending communism." Laughter rippled through the class, but Mr. Stevens waved it off. "Partially true, Brian. The Berlin Wall was more than just a physical barrier. It was a symbol of division, keeping families, friends, and entire communities apart for decades. Its fall represented freedom and the end of oppression for millions." Jessica sat up a little straighter, drawn in by the way Mr. Stevens made history feel alive. He always had a way of connecting these distant events to their lives. As he spoke, she found herself thinking about her own walls, the barriers she faced every day, both visible and invisible. "I want you all to think about something," Mr. Stevens continued, pacing the front of the classroom. "What kind of walls do we build in our own lives? And how can we tear them down? You don't need to answer out loud, but it's something worth thinking about." Jessica felt a chill run through her. His words hit closer to home than she liked to admit. She thought about the invisible walls of poverty that surrounded her family, the walls of judgment and bullying at school, and the emotional walls she had built to protect herself from it all. As Mr. Stevens transitioned into a discussion on the global impact of the Cold War, Jessica's attention began to drift. She caught snippets of the conversation around her. "Did you see Rachel's new phone?" a girl whispered to her friend 2 seats over. "She got the latest one again," the friend replied. "Must be nice to have parents who can buy you anything." Jessica bit the inside of her cheek, fighting back the familiar wave of envy that always seemed to accompany such conversations. She remembered the last time her dad had taken her shopping for school supplies. They had gone to a discount store, and she had picked out the cheapest backpack she could find. It was practical, but not fashionable. She could still hear Rachel's voice from last year, mocking the frayed straps. "Is that thing still holding together, or is it just for show?" Rachel had teased. The sting of those words lingered, and even now, as Jessica sat in the classroom, she felt the weight of her outdated belongings. Mr. Stevens' voice brought her back to the present. "All right, I want everyone to pair up for a quick exercise. I'll give each group a topic related to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you'll discuss its significance. Let's see. Jessica, you can pair with Rachel." Jessica's heart sank. She tried not to show her discomfort, but the sudden pairing felt like a cruel twist of fate. Rachel, sitting just 2 rows ahead, turned around slowly, her eyes narrowing with thinly veiled annoyance. "Great," Rachel muttered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Just who I wanted to work with." Jessica swallowed hard and forced a smile, gathering her notebook and making her way over to Rachel's desk. She could already feel the tension, the unspoken judgment hanging between them like a wall of its own. Mr. Stevens handed them their topic. "I want you two to discuss the significance of the wall's fall in terms of human rights and freedoms." Jessica nodded, grateful that at least the subject matter was straightforward. But Rachel had other plans. As soon as Mr. Stevens walked away, she leaned in, her tone dropping to a mocking whisper. "So, Jess," Rachel began, "got any big plans this weekend? Maybe hitting up the thrift store again? Or is that too expensive?" Jessica's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll probably just be studying." Rachel smirked, flipping her perfectly straightened hair over her shoulder. "Right, that's what people like you do. Study and what? Dream about someday having nice things." Jessica felt her patience thinning. She was used to Rachel's jabs, but today it cut deeper. Maybe it was the stress at home, the worry about her dad, or the fact that she had barely slept the night before. Whatever it was, she wasn't in the mood to be Rachel's punching bag. "We're supposed to be talking about the Berlin Wall," Jessica reminded her, trying to steer the conversation back to the assignment. "Human rights and freedoms." Rachel rolled her eyes, clearly uninterested. "Ugh, fine. Let's just get this over with." As they worked through the discussion, Jessica kept her responses brief and to the point. She knew that no matter how much effort she put in, Rachel wouldn't care. When they finished, Jessica returned to her seat, feeling drained. As Mr. Stevens moved around the room, checking on each pair, he stopped at Jessica's desk. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice kind but observant. "Fine," Jessica replied, though the exhaustion in her voice was clear. Mr. Stevens studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Keep at it. You're doing great." Jessica managed a weak smile, but the truth was she didn't feel great. The weight of everything, the teasing, the uncertainty about her dad's health, the constant struggle just to keep up, felt heavier than ever. She longed for a break, for something to change. Little did she know that change was coming, but it wouldn't be the kind of change she had hoped for. The bell rang, signaling the end of Mr. Stevens's history class. Jessica breathed a sigh of relief, though she knew the break between classes was often the hardest part of the day. While the lessons provided a brief distraction, the hallways were where the real challenges lay. As she gathered her books and prepared to leave, she felt a presence behind her. Jessica turned just in time to see Rachel and her group approaching, their expressions full of mischief. She immediately braced herself, knowing what was coming. "So, Harvard," Rachel said, leaning casually against Jessica's desk, blocking her path. Ready for another exciting weekend of, what, washing dishes? Or are you finally going to upgrade that bag to something that doesn't look like it came from a dumpster? Jessica clenched her fists around the strap of her backpack, forcing herself to stay calm. She had learned long ago that reacting would only make things worse. Rachel thrived on getting a rise out of people, and Jessica wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. "Leave me alone, Rachel," she muttered under her breath, trying to step around her, but Rachel wasn't done. "Oh, come on, it's all in good fun. You can take a joke, right?" The others snickered, their laughter filling the small space around Jessica as she tried to move through the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her every move, her every flaw. It was always the same. They would find something, anything to latch onto. Today, it was her backpack. Tomorrow it might be her shoes, or the fact that she didn't have the latest phone. Jessica finally managed to slip past Rachel, but as she made her way toward the door, Rachel's voice followed her. "Hey, why don't you just ask Daddy to buy you a new bag?" "Oh, wait, he can't afford it, can he?" The words hit harder than Jessica expected. She stopped in her tracks, her back stiffening. The mention of her father, especially with everything going on, was more than she could handle. Her father, who had always been her rock, was now struggling with his health in ways he tried to hide. Jessica had seen it, even though he pretended everything was fine. Taking a deep breath, Jessica kept walking. She had no choice. If she turned around, if she confronted Rachel, it would only make things worse. Instead, she focused on reaching her next class, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she turned the corner, heading toward her math class, she heard a voice call her name. "Jessica!" She glanced over her shoulder and saw Evan, one of the quieter boys in class, hurrying toward her. Unlike Rachel and her group, Evan never teased her. In fact, he was one of the few students who seemed to notice her in a way that wasn't filled with cruelty. "Hey," Evan said as he caught up with her, slightly out of breath. "I saw what Rachel did back there. She's a real piece of work." Jessica shrugged, though she appreciated the sentiment. "Yeah, well, it's nothing new." "I know, but it's still not right." Evan fell into step beside her as they walked down the hallway. "I don't know why she feels the need to make everyone's life miserable." Jessica gave a small, sad smile. Maybe it makes her feel better about herself. Evan glanced at her with a thoughtful look, but didn't press the issue. Instead, they walked together in silence for a few moments before Evan changed the subject. "So, are you ready for the math test next week?" "I'm totally freaking out." Jessica almost laughed. Despite everything, Evan always managed to bring some light into her day. "You'll be fine. It's just geometry." "Just geometry," Evan groaned. "You say that like it's not a big deal. For some of us, it's like a foreign language." Jessica chuckled, shaking her head. "Well, if you need help, I can try to explain it to you. It's not that hard once you get the hang of it." "Really?" Evan's face lit up with hope. "That would be amazing. You're, like, the smartest person in the class." Jessica felt her cheeks flush at the compliment. It wasn't often she heard anything positive from her classmates. "Thanks, but I'm not that smart. I just study a lot." "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working," Evan said with a grin. "You should be proud of yourself." Jessica's smile faded slightly as she thought about her father. He was always telling her the same thing, that she should be proud of herself. But how could she be proud when everything felt like it was falling apart at home? Her father's health was deteriorating, the bills were piling up, and now, on top of it all, she had to deal with Rachel's endless taunts. They reached the math classroom, and Jessica gave Evan a quick wave before heading to her seat. As she sat down, she noticed her hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't just the bullying that was getting to her, it was everything. The weight of her father's illness, the financial struggles, the uncertainty about the future, it all felt like too much sometimes. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jessica kept her head down, focusing on her work, doing her best to avoid any further encounters with Rachel. By the time the final bell rang, she was more than ready to go home. As she walked out of the school building, Jessica felt a sense of relief wash over her. The school day was over, and she could finally go home to the one place where she felt safe. But as she made her way down the sidewalk, she noticed something unusual. Her father's car was parked a block away, just out of view of the school. Her heart skipped a beat. He never picked her up from school. Something must have happened. Jessica quickened her pace, her mind racing with possibilities. By the time she reached the car, her father was already stepping out, looking pale and tired. "Dad," she asked, her voice filled with concern. "What are you doing here?" He smiled weakly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I just wanted to see you, Jess. Thought I'd give you a ride home today." Jessica frowned. Something wasn't right. "Are you okay?" He nodded, though the cough that followed said otherwise. "I'm fine, just a little tired." Jessica wasn't convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she climbed into the car, glancing at her father as he slid into the driver's seat beside her. The drive home was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Jessica wanted to ask more, to demand the truth, but she was afraid of what he might say. When they finally pulled into the driveway, her father turned to her, his expression softening. "You're doing great. You know that." Jessica blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean with everything. School, life. You're handling it all so well. I'm proud of you." Tears pricked at the corners of Jessica's eyes. She didn't feel like she was handling anything well. If anything, she felt like she was barely holding on. But she nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. Her father reached over, squeezing her hand. "We'll get through this, Jess, I promise." Jessica nodded again, though she wasn't sure she believed him. There were too many uncertainties, too many things out of their control. But for now, she clung to his words, hoping they were enough to carry her through. As the days passed, Jessica found herself sinking deeper into her routine of school, bullying, and the growing worry about her father. Each morning began with the same heavy feeling in her chest, a weight that grew heavier with every glance at her father's pale face. He tried to keep things normal, to smile and tell her everything was going to be okay, but Jessica could see through his words. She could hear the fatigue in his voice and the quiet coughs he tried to hide. One evening, as they sat together at the dinner table, Jessica finally found the courage to ask what had been haunting her for weeks. "Dad," she began, her voice hesitant, "are you really okay?" Her father looked up from his plate, surprised by her question. His dark brown eyes, once filled with boundless energy, now held a quiet exhaustion. He smiled softly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm just a little tired, that's all." Jessica frowned, her fork resting untouched beside her plate. "You've been tired a lot lately, more than usual." Her father sighed, setting down his own fork. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as though he could brush away the weariness that clung to him. "I know you're worried, Jess, but there's nothing to be afraid of." Jessica's chest tightened. She wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. "You promise?" "I promise," he said, though the cough that followed his words betrayed him. She stared at him for a moment longer, unsure whether to push for more answers or to accept what he was saying. After all, her father had always been the strongest person she knew. He had taken care of her and her sister, Sophie, after their mother left, and he had never complained, even when times got tough. He was the reason Jessica worked so hard in school, why she didn't give up even when the bullying became unbearable. He was her rock. But now, her rock seemed to be crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. "Let's talk about something else," her father suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "How's school going?" "Still acing those tests," Jessica shrugged. "It's fine, I guess." He raised an eyebrow. "You guess? That doesn't sound like the girl who always has her nose in a book." Jessica couldn't help but smile a little. "I'm doing okay. It's just some of the kids at school are giving me a hard time." Her father's expression softened. He reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jess. But you know, those kids don't define you. You're smarter, stronger, and braver than they'll ever be. Don't let them get to you. Jessica bit her lip, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She wanted to be as strong as her father believed she was, but some days it felt impossible. Some days, the weight of everything, school, home, her father's illness, was too much to bear. "I try," she whispered, "but it's hard." Her father squeezed her hand gently. "I know it is, but you've always been a fighter, Jess. You don't let the world tell you who you are. You decide that for yourself." Jessica nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed his words. Still, there was comfort in hearing them. Comfort in knowing that, despite everything, her father was still there, still fighting for her, even as his own strength seemed to be fading. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Jessica sat on the worn-out couch while her father took his usual place in his favorite armchair. The television was on, but neither of them was really paying attention. Jessica's mind was elsewhere, swirling with thoughts of school, her father's health, and the constant worry about their financial situation. "I got a letter from the school today," her father said suddenly, breaking the silence. Jessica looked up, confused. "From my school?" He nodded, reaching into the pocket of his shirt and pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Yeah, it's about you." Her heart skipped a beat. "What did it say?" Her father handed her the letter, his smile growing as she unfolded it. "Read it for yourself." Jessica's eyes scanned the page quickly, her breath catching as the words registered. It was a notification from the school's administration, congratulating her on her academic achievements and informing her that she had been selected as a candidate for a prestigious scholarship, one that could potentially lead to an opportunity at a top university, Harvard. Jessica blinked, her mind reeling. "Is this real?" she whispered, barely able to process the information. Her father chuckled. "It's real, all right. You've worked hard, and it's paying off." Jessica stared at the letter, disbelief washing over her. A scholarship to Harvard. It was something she had dreamed of but never dared to believe could happen. And yet, here it was, right in front of her. "Dad, I don't even know what to say," she murmured, still in shock. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, his voice warm with pride. "You earned this, Jess. You've always been destined for great things." Jessica's mind raced. This was everything she had been working toward, an opportunity to escape the suffocating reality of her life, to build a future beyond the struggles she and her family faced. But at the same time, a wave of guilt washed over her. How could she leave, knowing her father's health was declining, knowing that without her, things might get even harder? Her father seemed to sense her hesitation. "Don't start worrying about me, Jess. This is your chance. You have to take it." "But what about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if—" "Stop," he interrupted gently. "I'll be fine. You don't need to put your life on hold for me. You deserve this." Jessica bit her lip, tears threatening to spill over. "I don't want to lose you, Dad." Her father's expression softened, and he stood up, moving to sit beside her on the couch. He pulled her into a gentle hug, resting his chin on top of her head. "You're not going to lose me, Jess. I'm always going to be with you, no matter what." They stayed like that for a long time, the soft hum of the television the only sound in the room. Jessica clung to her father, trying to hold on to the moment, to the feeling of his arms around her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't ready to face it without him. Later that night, after her father had gone to bed, Jessica sat at the kitchen table, the scholarship letter spread out in front of her. She reread the words over and over, trying to convince herself that it was real, that she really had a chance to go to Harvard. But the excitement was tainted by the gnawing fear in the back of her mind, the fear that her father might not be around to see her achieve her dreams. She had seen the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, heard the way his breathing grew shallow when he climbed the stairs. He was trying to hide it, but Jessica knew. She knew that time was running out. As she folded the letter and tucked it back into its envelope, Jessica made a silent promise to herself. She would do whatever it took to get that scholarship, to build a future for herself and her family, but she wouldn't leave her father behind. She couldn't. No matter what happened, she would make sure he was taken care of. She owed him that much. The days after receiving the scholarship letter felt surreal to Jessica. The weight of everything at home didn't disappear, but for the first time, she could see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. Harvard, the name alone was enough to make her heart race. It was the kind of opportunity that most kids in her situation didn't get. A ticket out of the cycle of hardship that had defined her life for as long as she could remember. That morning, Jessica walked into school with a mix of anxiety and excitement bubbling under her skin. The letter was still in her backpack, tucked away like a precious secret, and she hadn't told anyone besides her father. It wasn't that she didn't want to share the news, she just wasn't sure how to. After all, what would Rachel and her group say? She could already hear the sarcasm in Rachel's voice if she ever found out. Jessica, going to Harvard, in that old backpack. As she made her way down the crowded hallway, her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sounds of laughter and chatter. Students were buzzing with their usual gossip, and as Jessica passed by, she could feel eyes on her. It was always like this. Her worn clothes and second-hand backpack made her stand out in a sea of brand names and new shoes. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket, a rare occurrence since she didn't have the latest gadget like her classmates. She pulled it out and saw a message from her little sister, Sophie. Sophie, I heard from Dad. You got a scholarship to Harvard? Jessica's heart dropped. She had wanted to tell Sophie in person, but it seemed her father had beaten her to it. A part of her was touched that he was so proud, but another part of her was nervous. Sophie was only 10 years old, but she was smart, too smart sometimes, and Jessica knew that her sister would have questions. How long would she be gone? Would she have to leave the family behind? As if on cue, another message came through. Sophie, what does this mean? Are you leaving? I don't want you to go, Jess. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat and quickly typed a response. Jessica, don't worry. We'll talk about it when I get home. I'm not going anywhere right now, okay? She slipped her phone back into her pocket and tried to push the worry out of her mind. There was still time to figure things out. Right now, she needed to get through the day. In her first class, English, the teacher, Mrs. Donovan, started discussing their upcoming project on influential women in history. As the class worked in groups, Jessica kept to herself, trying to focus on her research. But her concentration was interrupted by the sound of Rachel's voice floating across the room. So, Jessica, Rachel began, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. Heard anything from that scholarship application yet? I mean, it's Harvard, so it's not like they just let anyone in. Jessica glanced up, her heart racing. How did Rachel know about the scholarship? Had her father told someone at the school? She forced a neutral expression. Yeah, I heard back. They're considering me. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. Considering you? Wow, that's cute. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's great you even applied, but let's be real. Harvard is for, like, future presidents. Not, well, people like you. Jessica's stomach churned. She hated how Rachel could take something so personal and turn it into a spectacle for everyone around to enjoy. Rachel's friends giggled behind her, clearly enjoying the show. Before Jessica could respond, Mrs. Donovan called for the class's attention. All right, everyone, back to work. I'll be coming around to check your progress. Rachel threw one last smirk in Jessica's direction before turning back to her group. Jessica tried to shake off the encounter, but the sting of Rachel's words lingered. It wasn't that she believed what Rachel said, not entirely, but part of her feared she might be right. Could someone like her really make it at Harvard? She didn't come from a wealthy family. She didn't have connections. And despite her hard work, sometimes it felt like the odds were stacked too high. At lunch, Jessica sat at her usual spot in the cafeteria, away from the louder, more popular tables. She pulled out a sandwich her dad had made for her, trying to ignore the knot in her stomach. Her mind wandered to the conversation she would have to have with Sophie later. How could she explain everything without making her sister feel abandoned? As she sat lost in thought, Evan, the boy from her math class, slid into the seat across from her. "Hey, Jessica, mind if I sit here?" She shook her head. "No, go ahead." Evan unwrapped his own sandwich, glancing at her curiously. "You okay? You seemed kind of off today." Jessica hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to share. "It's nothing. Just a lot on my mind." He nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "I get that. I heard about the scholarship. That's amazing, Jess." Jessica blinked in surprise. "You heard?" Evan grinned. "Yeah, well, my mom works in the school office, so I hear things. But seriously, Harvard, that's incredible. You deserve it." His words were sincere, and for a moment, Jessica felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was nice to hear someone say it without any malice or jealousy behind it. "Thanks," she murmured, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. I don't know. It feels too good to be true, you know? And there's a lot going on at home." Evan nodded again, his expression sympathetic. "I get it. My older brother went through something similar when he got into college. There's a lot to think about, but you'll figure it out." "You're smart." Jessica smiled softly, grateful for Evan's kindness. He wasn't like the other kids, who saw her only as an easy target. With Evan, she could be herself. No pretenses, no walls. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Jessica moved from class to class, her mind constantly drifting back to her father and Sophie. The idea of going to Harvard was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was everything she had worked for, but it also meant leaving behind the people who needed her most. When the final bell rang, Jessica hurried home, her heart heavy with the conversation she knew she had to have. As she walked through the door of their small apartment, the familiar scent of her father's cooking greeted her. He was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew, while Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her face buried in a book. "Hey, Jess!" Sophie called out, her voice brighter than Jessica expected. "Did you talk to anyone else about the scholarship? I told Dad we should have a celebration." Jessica forced a smile. "Not yet, Soph. I've still got a lot to figure out." Her father turned from the stove, wiping his hands on a towel. "There's nothing to figure out, Jess. You're going to Harvard. We'll make it work." Jessica bit her lip, uncertainty gnawing at her. She glanced at Sophie, who was looking up at her with wide, eager eyes, and then back at her father. "But what about you? What about everything here?" Her father waved her concerns away. "We'll manage. Don't worry about us. You've worked too hard to pass this up." Jessica's heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, to trust that everything would be okay. But the truth was, she wasn't sure. How could she leave her family behind when they needed her the most? That night, as Jessica lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The late night studying, the sacrifices her father had made, the bullying she had endured. And now, the future she had always dreamed of was within reach, but at what cost? As sleep slowly crept over her, one thing became clear. No matter what she decided, it wouldn't be easy. The next morning, the weight of the scholarship still pressed heavily on Jessica's shoulders as she walked to the kitchen, her mind swirling with uncertainty. She found her father humming softly to himself, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. His resilience, despite everything, never failed to amaze her. His smile was small but genuine, and it reminded her of all the sacrifices he'd made for their family over the years. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "I was just about to call you and Sophie for breakfast." Jessica smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She sat down at the table, noticing the quiet hum of the radio playing in the background. Sophie was already there, her bright eyes filled with excitement as she devoured a slice of toast. "Morning, Jess," Sophie chirped, practically bouncing in her seat. "Dad said we should go shopping for new school supplies today. You need new stuff for Harvard." Jessica's stomach tightened. The word Harvard felt heavier each time she heard it. "I don't know if I'm ready for that yet, Soph. We don't have to rush." Sophie frowned, a confused look crossing her face. "But you're going, right? It's Harvard, Jess. You have to go." Their father chuckled as he set a bowl of oatmeal in front of Sophie. "She's right, you know. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We should start getting ready." Jessica's heart raced. "But what about you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if you need me?" Her father's smile softened, and he sat down across from her, his eyes filled with understanding. "Jess, we've talked about this. I'm going to be fine. I've got my treatments lined up, and Sophie's doing great. You can't put your life on hold for us." Sophie nodded eagerly, clearly oblivious to the weight of Jessica's concerns. "Yeah, we'll be fine. Plus, you'll be super smart. And when you're a famous scientist or something, you can buy us all kinds of cool stuff." Jessica couldn't help but laugh at Sophie's enthusiasm, though the knot of anxiety in her chest remained. "It's not about buying things, Soph," she said gently. "It's about making sure you and Dad are okay." "We will be," her father assured her. "I've been thinking about this a lot, Jess. I know things are hard right now, but this is your chance to make something incredible out of your life. You've worked so hard, and you deserve to go." Jessica stared down at the table, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. She wanted to believe him, but the uncertainty of it all made it hard to feel confident. She wasn't just worried about their finances or her father's health. She was scared of leaving them behind, scared of what might happen while she was gone. Her father seemed to sense her hesitation. He reached across the table and placed a hand on hers. "We'll be okay, Jess. You've always taken care of us, but now it's time for you to take care of yourself, too." Sophie's face lit up again, and she bounced in her seat. "So, can we go shopping today? I heard there's a sale at the store down the street." Jessica glanced at her father, who gave her a gentle nod. "We could use a little celebration," he said, "and you deserve some new supplies for your new adventure." Jessica's heart softened at the sight of her sister's excitement. Sophie was still too young to fully understand everything that was going on, but her happiness was contagious. "All right," she said, smiling. "Let's go after breakfast." The plan was set, and for a brief moment, the worries that had plagued Jessica's mind seemed to ease. They finished their breakfast, and soon after, the three of them piled into her father's old car, heading toward the shopping district in their small town. It wasn't anything fancy. Most of the stores were local, small businesses struggling to keep up, but it was enough for what they needed. As they walked down the sidewalk, Sophie chattered excitedly about the supplies she wanted. "We need notebooks and pens and those highlighters that smell like fruit," she exclaimed, practically skipping ahead of them. Jessica laughed, feeling a warmth in her chest as she watched her sister's boundless energy. Her father walked beside her, his pace slower than usual, but his smile still intact. "You know," he said quietly, "this reminds me of when you were Sophie's age. You used to get so excited about back-to-school shopping. I'd take you to that little bookstore downtown, and you'd spend hours picking out the perfect notebooks." Jessica smiled at the memory. "I remember, you always let me choose one book, no matter how tight things were." Her father nodded. "And it was always worth it. You've been a bookworm since the day you learned to read." They entered the stationery store, a small, cozy shop with shelves lined with notebooks, pens, and school supplies of every kind. Sophie darted ahead, grabbing items and holding them up for Jessica's approval. "What about this one, Jess? It has sparkles." Jessica chuckled. "I think that's a bit much for me, Soph." Her father leaned in, his voice low. "You should get something special for yourself, too. This is a big moment for you." Jessica hesitated, glancing at the shelves. It felt strange to think about celebrating when there was still so much uncertainty in their lives. But as her fingers brushed the cover of a sleek, new notebook, she realized how much she'd been holding back. This scholarship, this opportunity, wasn't just about her. It was about all of them. It was about building a future that could help take care of her family. After an hour of browsing, they finally left the store with bags filled with supplies, Sophie beaming with pride over her new rainbow-colored highlighters, and Jessica clutching a simple, elegant notebook she had chosen for herself. Their next stop was the small bakery at the end of the street. Sophie had begged to stop for donuts, claiming it was the perfect way to celebrate Jessica's scholarship. Jessica had tried to protest, but her father had insisted, saying it was a small treat for a big accomplishment. They entered the bakery, the sweet scent of fresh pastries filling the air. Sophie immediately ran to the counter, pressing her nose against the glass as she inspected the display of colorful donuts. "Can we get the ones with sprinkles?" Sophie asked, her voice full of excitement. Her father chuckled. "We can get whatever you want, Soph." Jessica couldn't help but smile as she watched her sister. For a moment, it felt like everything was normal, like they were just a regular family out for a simple day of shopping and treats, without the weight of illness or financial struggles hanging over them. As they sat down with their donuts and coffee, Sophie took a huge bite of hers, frosting smearing across her cheek. "This is the best day ever," she declared, her voice muffled by the donut. Jessica laughed, shaking her head. "You say that every time we get donuts." "Well, it's true," Sophie grinned, wiping her face with a napkin. Their father took a sip of his coffee, his eyes twinkling with warmth as he looked at his daughters. "This is what it's all about," he said softly. "Moments like these." Jessica's smile faltered slightly at the mention of moments. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, out of moments. She glanced at her father, noticing the way his hands trembled slightly as he held his coffee cup. He quickly set it down, trying to hide the tremor, but Jessica saw it. She always saw it. Later that evening, as they returned home, Jessica helped Sophie put away her new supplies while her father rested on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV. The house felt warm, safe, a stark contrast to the uncertainty that had weighed so heavily on Jessica's mind earlier that morning. But as she stood in Sophie's room, watching her little sister eagerly organize her notebooks and pencils, that familiar knot of anxiety returned. How much longer could they keep pretending everything was fine? How much longer could her father keep up the facade? Jessica sighed, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't have all the answers, but for now, she would hold on to this day, this moment of normalcy, because deep down, she knew that soon, everything would change. The morning after their little family celebration, Jessica found herself back at the breakfast table, but this time, the air felt heavier. The joy of their shopping trip was now a distant memory, replaced by the familiar undercurrent of worry. Her father sat across from her, his smile dimmed by exhaustion, while Sophie, ever oblivious, hummed to herself as she prepared her backpack for school. Jessica stared at her half-eaten toast, her appetite dulled by the anxiety that had crept back in overnight. The reality of her situation weighed on her more than ever. Harvard, her father's illness, the endless taunts at school. She knew that if she left for college, her family would be left vulnerable, and the idea of walking away felt impossible. "Jess?" Her father's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "You've been quiet all morning. What's on your mind?" Jessica hesitated, glancing over at Sophie to make sure she wasn't paying attention. Once she was sure her sister was engrossed in her own world, she spoke softly. It's just the usual stuff." Her father raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "You mean school or something else?" "Both," Jessica admitted, her voice low. "The scholarship is great, but there's so much going on. I don't know how I'm supposed to balance it all." Her father nodded slowly, his gaze gentle. "You don't have to balance it all by yourself, Jess. You've got me and Sophie. We'll figure things out together." Jessica bit her lip, feeling the familiar sting of frustration. "But you don't understand, Dad. Things are hard enough at school already, with, the way people treat me. And now, with this scholarship, I just know it's going to get worse." Her father's expression darkened slightly. Concern etched into his face. "Are you still having trouble with those kids?" Jessica nodded, her stomach tightening as the memories of Rachel and her friends flooded her mind. "It's not like I haven't dealt with it before, but it feels worse now. They make fun of everything. My clothes, my backpack, the fact that we don't have money like they do. And if they find out about Harvard," she trailed off, not wanting to admit her deepest fear, that the news of her scholarship would make her a bigger target. Rachel and her group had already mocked her for simply applying to Harvard. What would they do if they found out she'd actually won a scholarship? Her father reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I'm sorry, Jess. I had no idea it was still this bad. But listen to me. You can't let those girls define you. What they think doesn't matter." Jessica sighed. "I know, but it's hard not to let it get to me." Her father's grip tightened, his voice filled with quiet determination. "I know it is, but you've always been stronger than them. You're kind, smart, and you work hard. That's why you got the scholarship. Not because of where you come from or what you have, but because of who you are." Jessica blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over. She wanted to believe him, but sometimes it felt like the weight of everything was too much. How was she supposed to ignore the bullying when it was a constant presence in her life? "Dad, they don't just make fun of me," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. Sometimes it feels like they're trying to break me down." Her father's face hardened with concern. "Jess, why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to worry you," she admitted, her voice small. "You've already got so much on your plate with your health and everything else. I didn't want to add to it." Her father shook his head, his expression softening. "You should never feel like you have to handle things on your own, Jess. You're my daughter, and I'll always be here to help you, even when things get tough for me." Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat, trying to find comfort in his words. But the truth was, she wasn't sure how much longer her father would be able to keep that promise. His illness was progressing faster than either of them wanted to admit, and deep down, Jessica feared that time was running out. Sophie interrupted the moment, bounding into the room with her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Jess, are you ready? We have to leave soon or we'll be late." Jessica forced a smile, nodding as she stood up from the table. "Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go." Her father stood as well, reaching for his keys. "I'll drive you both today." Jessica hesitated, glancing at her father's pale face. He looked so tired, but she knew better than to argue with him. "Are you sure? You don't have to if you're not feeling up to it." "I'm fine," he insisted, his tone firm but kind. "Come on, let's get going." The drive to school was quiet, with Sophie happily chattering in the back seat, while Jessica stared out the window, lost in her own thoughts. Her father drove slowly, his movements more deliberate than they used to be, but he didn't complain. Jessica could see the effort it took for him to maintain a sense of normalcy, even when she knew how much pain he must be in. When they pulled up to the school, Sophie jumped out of the car, waving goodbye before running off to meet her friends. Jessica lingered for a moment, turning to her father. "Thanks for driving us," she said softly. "I know it's not easy for you." Her father smiled, though the exhaustion in his eyes was evident. "It's nothing. Just remember what we talked about, okay? Don't let those kids get to you." Jessica nodded, though she wasn't sure how to follow through on that advice. "I'll try." With one last look, she climbed out of the car and made her way toward the school entrance. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar feeling of anxiety washed over her. She kept her head down, hoping to avoid any unwanted attention. But of course, Rachel and her group were waiting. They stood near the lockers, their eyes already on Jessica as she approached. "Well, look who it is," Rachel called out, her voice laced with sarcasm. "Miss Harvard herself." Jessica's stomach twisted. How had they already found out? Rachel smirked, crossing her arms as she sauntered over. "I heard about your little scholarship. It's cute that you think you belong at a place like Harvard." Jessica kept walking, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to engage, didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing they'd gotten under her skin. Rachel's voice followed her down the hallway. "You can't hide behind that scholarship forever, Jess. It doesn't change who you really are. You'll always be the girl with the old backpack and second-hand clothes." Jessica's eyes stung, but she refused to let the tears fall. She kept moving, her footsteps quick and deliberate as she made her way to her first class. Once inside, she slumped into her seat, staring blankly at the front of the room as the weight of Rachel's words pressed down on her. It wasn't just about the scholarship or the clothes. It was about the fear that Rachel was right. that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how far she went, she would never really escape the life she was born into, the life of struggle and hardship that had defined her for so long. But as the class filled up and the lesson began, Jessica forced herself to push those thoughts aside. She couldn't afford to let the bullying consume her. Not now. She had worked too hard to get where she was, and she wasn't about to let Rachel take that away from her. For the rest of the day, Jessica stayed quiet, keeping to herself as much as possible. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, but she did her best to ignore them. When the final bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Jessica breathed a sigh of relief and hurried out of the building, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the school. As she made her way home, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message from her father. "Dad, how was school today? You doing okay?" Jessica stared at the screen for a moment before typing a response. "Jessica, it was fine. Same as always." It wasn't the whole truth, but she didn't want to worry him. He had enough on his plate already. That night, as she lay in bed, Jessica thought about her father's words from that morning. He had always believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And as much as the bullying hurt, as much as Rachel's words echoed in her mind, Jessica knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let them win. She had to keep going. For herself, for her father, for Sophie. Because no matter how hard things got, she knew that her family was depending on her to succeed. Jessica returned home from school that day with an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The bullying had reached new levels, and the weight of Rachel's taunts seemed to echo in her mind with every step she took. But more than anything, it was the gnawing concern for her father's health that made everything feel so much heavier. She had tried to push it to the back of her mind, but every time she saw him, the truth became harder to ignore. When she stepped inside the house, the quiet felt unusual. Normally, Sophie would be in the living room watching TV or doing her homework, but today the house felt still, too still. "Dad!" she called out, setting her backpack by the door. "Sophie?" There was no response. Jessica's heart began to race as she hurried down the hallway toward her father's bedroom. The door was half open, and as she pushed it further, she saw her father lying in bed, pale and unmoving. For a moment, panic seized her chest. "Dad!" she called, rushing to his side. She shook his shoulder gently, her voice trembling. "Dad, wake up!" Her father stirred, opening his eyes slowly. He blinked a few times before giving her a weak smile. "Hey, Jess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine, just resting." But Jessica could see the strain in his expression. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow. This wasn't just exhaustion, something was wrong. "You don't look fine," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think you need to go to the doctor." Her father shook his head weakly. "I've been to the doctor, Jess. This is just part of it. Part of it." The words felt like a punch to Jessica's gut. Her father had been battling his illness for months, but he had always tried to downplay it, never wanting to worry her or Sophie. But now, it was clear that things were worse than he was letting on. "Dad," Jessica said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You need help." "I'm scared." Her father's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I know, sweetheart, but I'm doing everything I can. The treatments, they help, but they take a lot out of me." Jessica felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She couldn't cry in front of him. He needed her to be strong, just like he had always been for her. "I'll be okay," he continued, his voice reassuring. "You don't need to worry about me." But how could she not worry? Her father had always been the strongest person she knew, but now he looked so fragile. The man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders when she was little now struggled to sit up in bed. "I'm going to call the doctor," Jessica said, standing up, "just to make sure everything's okay." Her father sighed, too tired to argue. "All right, but don't worry, Sophie. She doesn't need to know how bad it is." Jessica nodded, though a part of her knew that keeping Sophie in the dark wouldn't last much longer. Her little sister was smart. She would figure it out eventually. Jessica stepped out of the room and quickly dialed the doctor's number. As the phone rang, her hands trembled. She had always known that her father's illness was serious, but seeing him like this made it all feel so much more real. When the doctor's office finally picked up, she spoke in a rush, explaining the situation and asking for advice. The nurse on the other end listened carefully before speaking. "It sounds like your father is experiencing fatigue from the treatments. It's not uncommon, but if he's struggling to wake up or his breathing is shallow, you should bring him in immediately." Jessica's heart sank. "But he doesn't want to go to the hospital," she said, her voice small. "I understand," the nurse replied, "but it's important that we monitor him closely. If his condition worsens, it's better to be safe and get him checked out." Jessica thanked the nurse and hung up, her mind racing. She knew she had to convince her father to go, but she wasn't sure how to do it without making him feel like he was losing control. He had always been so independent, so strong. Asking for help wasn't easy for him. As she walked back to her father's room, she paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. She had to stay calm. Her father needed her to be level-headed, even though inside she was falling apart. "Dad," she said gently as she re-entered the room. "I talked to the nurse. She said it would be a good idea to go to the hospital, just to make sure everything's okay." Her father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't want to spend more time in the hospital, Jess. I've had enough of those sterile rooms and machines." "I know," she said, sitting beside him again. "But I need you to be okay. Please, Dad. For me and Sophie." For a moment, her father didn't respond. He looked down at his hands, the tremor in them barely noticeable but still there. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "All right, let's go." Jessica felt a rush of relief, though it was tinged with sadness. She hated seeing him like this, tired, vulnerable. It wasn't the way she wanted to think of her father. But right now, getting him help was the most important thing. They made their way to the hospital, with Sophie sitting quietly in the back seat, a worried expression on her face. Jessica tried to reassure her, telling her that it was just a routine checkup, but she could tell that Sophie wasn't convinced. Jessica wasn't convinced either. At the hospital, they were taken into a small room where a doctor examined her father. The minutes stretched on, each second filled with silent tension. Jessica sat beside her father, holding his hand while Sophie sat in a chair by the window, watching with wide eyes. When the doctor finally spoke, his voice was calm but serious. "Your father's condition is stable, but the treatments are taking a toll on his body. We need to monitor him closely, and he may need to stay overnight for observation." Jessica nodded, her heart heavy. She knew that staying in the hospital was the last thing her father wanted, but at this point, it wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what he needed. As the nurses prepared to take her father to a room, Jessica squeezed his hand. "I'll stay with you," she said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." Her father smiled weakly. "You don't have to, Jess. You should go home and rest." "I'm staying," she insisted, her voice firm. "I need to be here." Her father didn't argue, and as they wheeled him away, Jessica felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that he was getting the care he needed, but also a deep, gnawing fear. What if this was just the beginning of something worse? What if they were running out of time? That night, as Jessica sat by her father's hospital bed, she watched him sleep, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She glanced at Sophie, who had fallen asleep in a chair, curled up with her jacket as a blanket. Jessica's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. She had always known that life was fragile, that nothing was guaranteed. But now, as she sat there in the cold, sterile hospital room, the reality of it all hit her like a tidal wave. She wasn't ready to lose him. She wasn't ready for any of this. It had been a long, exhausting night. Jessica barely slept, her mind buzzing with worry as she sat by her father's hospital bed. The steady beeping of the machines was a constant reminder of his fragility. each sound pulling her deeper into the reality she had tried so hard to avoid. Sophie, curled up in the chair across the room, had managed to drift off, her small body rising and falling with every quiet breath. But Jessica remained wide awake, watching over her father. He looked peaceful, as if he was simply resting after a long day, but Jessica knew better. The doctors had explained his condition was worsening, that the treatments were no longer as effective as they once had been. The news had hit her like a brick, knocking the air from her lungs. She had sat in stunned silence as the doctor spoke, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Now, as the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow through the hospital window, Jessica reached out to touch her father's hand. His skin was cool to the touch, and the slight tremor in his fingers had grown more pronounced overnight. He stirred slightly at her touch, his eyelids fluttering open. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice hoarse but full of warmth. "You've been here all night." Jessica forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. I wasn't going to leave you." Her father gave a weak chuckle. "You're too good to me, Jess. I don't deserve a daughter like you." Tears pricked at the corners of Jessica's eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to cry in front of him. "Don't say that," she whispered. "You're the best dad in the world." Her father sighed, his chest rising and falling with the effort of each breath. "I'm sorry, Jess. I wanted to be stronger for you." "For Sophie." Jessica shook her head, her voice trembling. "You've always been strong, Dad, stronger than anyone I know." But as she said the words, Jessica knew they were no longer true. The man who had once been her rock, her protector, was fading before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her father's eyes softened, and he squeezed her hand weakly. "You've been strong for both of us, Jess. I'm so proud of you. You've got a big future ahead of you. Don't ever forget that." Jessica nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to tell him so much, how much he meant to her, how scared she was to lose him, how she didn't know how she would go on without him. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled with the tears she was trying so hard to hold back. "I love you, Dad," she whispered instead, her voice barely audible. Her father smiled, his eyes misty. "I love you too, sweetheart. More than you'll ever know." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds in the room coming from the steady beep of the heart monitor and Sophie's soft breathing from the chair. Jessica watched as her father's eyelids began to droop again, his body succumbing to the exhaustion that had been weighing him down for so long. "Get some rest, Dad," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair away from his forehead. "I'll be right here." He nodded weakly, his eyes closing once more. Within minutes, his breathing had slowed, and he drifted back into a fitful sleep. Jessica stayed by his side, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their time together was running out. By midday, Jessica knew something had changed. Her father's breathing had grown shallow, the rise and fall of his chest barely noticeable. His skin had taken on a pallor that made her stomach twist with fear. She reached out to touch his hand again, but this time there was no response. His fingers lay limp in hers, cold and unmoving. "Dad!" Jessica's voice trembled as she leaned closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad! Wake up!" But there was no answer. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had slowed, each sound more spaced out than the last. "Dad!" Jessica cried, her voice rising in panic. She jumped to her feet, her hands shaking as she pressed the call button for the nurse. "Please, wake up. Don't leave me." Within seconds, the room was flooded with medical staff, their voices calm and professional as they moved around her. But Jessica couldn't hear them. All she could hear was the sound of her father's slowing heartbeat, the sound of time slipping away from her. One of the nurses gently guided her out of the way, whispering words of comfort that Jessica couldn't process. She watched in numb silence as the doctors worked, their faces grim as they checked her father's vitals. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the heart monitor let out a long, piercing beep that echoed through the room. Jessica's world stopped. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No, please. The doctor turned to her, his expression filled with sorrow. I'm so sorry, Jessica. We did everything we could. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Jessica stumbled backward, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in around her as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Her father was gone. Sophie, who had been woken by the commotion, let out a small, frightened gasp from across the room. "Jess," she whimpered, her voice filled with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" Jessica turned to her sister, her heart breaking all over again. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around Sophie, pulling her close as the younger girl began to cry. He's gone, Soph," Jessica whispered, her voice shaking. "Dad's gone." Sophie buried her face in Jessica's chest, her small body trembling with sobs. Jessica held her tightly, trying to stay strong for her sister, but inside she felt like she was falling apart. For what felt like hours, they stayed like that, the two of them clinging to each other as the nurses quietly left the room, giving them space to grieve. Jessica's mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, sadness, anger, and overwhelming guilt. She had known this day was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of losing her father. Later that evening, after the hospital staff had made the necessary arrangements, Jessica and Sophie returned home. The house felt unbearably quiet without their father's presence. The familiar warmth and comfort of their little home now replaced by a suffocating emptiness. Jessica walked into the living room, her legs feeling heavy, her heart hollow. She sat down on the couch, staring blankly at the walls, her mind numb from the day's events. Sophie followed her into the room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She sat beside Jessica, curling up against her, seeking comfort in her sister's presence. "What are we going to do now, Jess?" Sophie asked, her voice small and fragile. Jessica swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't have an answer. How could she? Everything had changed in an instant, and now it was just the two of them, alone, without their father. "I don't know," Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we'll figure it out, Soph. We have to." Sophie nodded, though her eyes were still filled with uncertainty. She leaned her head on Jessica's shoulder, her small hand gripping Jessica's tightly. As they sat together in the quiet, Jessica knew that the road ahead would be hard. There would be grief, pain, and 1,000 unanswered questions, but she also knew that she had to be strong, for Sophie, for herself, and for the memory of their father, because even though he was gone, his love and his strength would always be with them. The days following their father's death were a blur of grief and disbelief for Jessica and Sophie. The house, once filled with his comforting presence, now felt hollow. Every room a reminder of the life they had lost. Jessica tried her best to stay strong for Sophie, but the weight of their new reality pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She found herself lost in the mundane tasks of planning the funeral, dealing with paperwork, and comforting her younger sister, all while navigating her own overwhelming sorrow. Their father had been their foundation, the one who held everything together, and now that he was gone, Jessica felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Each day was harder than the last, the quiet in the house unbearable. Sophie clung to her more than ever, afraid to leave her side, as though Jessica was the last tether to the stability they once knew. A week after the funeral, Jessica received a call that would forever change the course of their lives. She had been expecting more condolences from family friends, or perhaps someone from the hospital, but when she answered, the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and completely unexpected. "Hello, is this Jessica Williams?" the voice asked, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "Yes, this is she," Jessica replied, her voice subdued from days of barely speaking. "My name is Mr. Morgan. I'm an attorney who handled some of your father's affairs. I'd like to schedule a time to meet with you and your sister to discuss something important regarding his estate." Jessica blinked, surprised. Her father's estate. She didn't even realize he had anything worth mentioning. Their father had always lived modestly, and she had assumed they were barely scraping by like most other families in their neighborhood. "I'm sorry," she said, her confusion evident. "I don't think we have any estate to speak of." "My father didn't have much." Mr. Morgan's tone remained steady. "That's understandable, but I assure you, there are some important matters that need to be discussed. I believe you'll find this meeting necessary. Would you and your sister be available tomorrow afternoon at my office?" Jessica hesitated. What could her father have left behind? The last thing she wanted to deal with was more paperwork or debts. But something in the lawyer's tone piqued her curiosity. "Yes," she said finally, "we'll be there." The next day, Jessica and Sophie made their way to Mr. Morgan's office in the center of town. The building was old but well kept, its stone facade giving it a sense of importance. Sophie clutched Jessica's hand tightly as they entered the office, the weight of the past week still heavy on both of them. Mr. Morgan greeted them with a kind smile, guiding them into his office, where a large oak desk sat surrounded by neatly organized files. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, offering his condolences before taking a seat. "Your father was a good man, and I know this must be a difficult time for you both." Jessica nodded, still unsure of why they were there. "Thank you," she murmured, "but I'm not sure what this is about. My dad didn't leave much behind." Mr. Morgan smiled gently, folding his hands in front of him. "I understand why you would think that, but there's something you may not have known about your father." Jessica's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The lawyer leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Your father was much more than he appeared. In fact, he had significant financial assets, ones he kept private for reasons that are his own." Jessica's mind raced. This didn't make any sense. "Are you saying my dad had money, like a lot of money?" Mr. Morgan nodded. "Yes, your father was in fact a millionaire. His estate includes a substantial amount of wealth that he had accumulated over the years." Jessica's mouth fell open in shock. Sophie, sitting beside her, looked equally confused, her wide eyes darting between Jessica and the lawyer. "That can't be right," Jessica said, shaking her head. "We've been struggling for as long as I can remember. He never told us about this." "I know this is difficult to process," Mr. Morgan said gently, "but your father chose to live modestly, even though he had the means to live a very different lifestyle. He made careful investments over the years, and he did well for himself. He wanted to ensure that you and Sophie would be taken care of." Jessica felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. How could her father have hidden something like this? Why had he chosen to keep them in the dark, living in near poverty, when they could have had a completely different life? "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't he tell us?" Mr. Morgan glanced down at the file in front of him. "I can't speak for your father's reasons, but I can tell you that everything he did was out of love for you and Sophie. He left specific instructions for how his assets were to be handled after his death, and it's clear that he wanted you both to have a secure future." Jessica sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. Millionaires didn't live in small houses with second-hand furniture. They didn't drive old cars or worry about medical bills. But her father had, and now it felt like there was this whole other side of him she had never known. "What does this mean for us?" Sophie asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. Mr. Morgan smiled at her kindly. "It means that you and your sister will inherit everything. The house, the investments, the savings, it's all yours. Your father also set up a trust for Sophie, which will ensure she's taken care of until she turns 18. Jessica's head was spinning. It was too much to process all at once. She had gone from thinking they were on the edge of financial ruin to learning that they were wealthy. It didn't feel real. "There's more," Mr. Morgan continued, pulling out another document from the folder. "Your father left a letter for you. I think it will help answer some of your questions." Jessica's hands trembled as she took the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't expected this. None of it. Carefully, she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. She could almost hear her father's voice as she read, My dearest Jessica, by the time you read this, I will no longer be there to explain things in person. I know you must be confused, maybe even angry, and I don't blame you for that, but I want you to understand why I made the choices I did. I never wanted money to define us, Jess. I didn't want you and Sophie to grow up thinking that material things were what mattered most in life. I wanted you to know the value of hard work, of kindness, of family. I didn't want wealth to separate us from the real world, from the people we love. Everything I did was for you and Sophie. I wanted to make sure you were both taken care of, but I also wanted you to grow up with the values that truly matter. You've worked so hard, and I'm so proud of the young woman you've become. Now it's your turn to decide what to do with this gift. Use it wisely, Jess. But most of all, remember that love and family are worth more than any amount of money. I love you with all my heart. Take care of your sister and take care of yourself, Dad. By the time Jessica finished reading, her vision was blurred with tears. The letter was everything she hadn't known she needed to hear. Her father's reasoning made sense, even if it hurt that he hadn't trusted them with the truth while he was still alive. Sophie reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. Jess, what are we going to do now? Jessica wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath as she folded the letter back up. We're going to be okay, she said softly. Dad made sure of that, but as she said the words, Jessica knew that this newfound wealth would bring its own set of challenges. There were decisions to be made, responsibilities to handle, and the looming question of how this would change their lives. For now, though, one thing was certain. Her father's love had left them with more than just money. He had given them the strength to face whatever came next. The ride home from Mr. Morgan's office was quiet. The weight of their father's revelation sat heavy on Jessica and Sophie. Neither of them spoke, lost in their own thoughts about what it all meant. As Jessica drove through their small neighborhood, passing by the familiar streets and worn-down homes, it felt surreal to think that they were no longer struggling financially, that they had inherited their father's hidden wealth, a secret he had kept from them their entire lives. When they finally arrived home, Jessica parked the car and sat still for a moment, staring at their small house. The paint was chipped, the windows needed new curtains, and the porch had seen better days. Yet, despite its humble appearance, this house had always been their home. Now, with everything they had learned, Jessica wondered if it still would be. Sophie broke the silence. Jess, what are we supposed to do now? Jessica turned to her younger sister, who looked as lost and confused as she felt. Sophie was only 10, too young to understand the complexities of wealth, of what this new chapter meant for their lives. For Sophie, their father's death was still the most important thing, the raw pain of losing him still fresh. I'm not sure, Soph, Jessica replied softly, but we'll figure it out together. They walked into the house, and the familiar smell of their father's cologne still lingered in the air. It was a painful reminder of his absence, and as Jessica set her keys down on the table, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She couldn't shake the feeling that accepting this inheritance, this wealth, somehow betrayed the life they had lived with him. Do you think Dad would have wanted us to use the money? Sophie asked, sitting down on the couch and looking up at Jessica with wide, questioning eyes. Jessica sighed, sitting beside her sister. I think Dad wanted us to be okay. He didn't want us to struggle. That's why he saved the money for us, even though he never told us about it. Sophie frowned, pulling her knees up to her chest. But why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he want us to have nice things? We could have had a better house, better clothes. Jessica understood Sophie's confusion. She had thought the same thing. Why had their father hidden this from them? Why had he let them live a life of struggle when he could have changed it with the snap of his fingers? I think Dad believed that there are more important things than money, Jessica explained, trying to put her father's words into perspective. He wanted us to understand what really matters in life: family, love, hard work. If we'd had everything handed to us, we might not have learned those lessons. Sophie looked down, playing with the hem of her shirt. I guess. but it still hurts. He's gone, and now we have all this money, but it doesn't bring him back. Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. Sophie was right. The money, the inheritance, none of it could replace their father. None of it could heal the hole he had left in their lives. She reached out and pulled Sophie into a hug, holding her tightly. "I know," Jessica whispered. "I miss him too." For a while, they sat like that, finding comfort in each other's presence. Jessica's mind raced with questions about what to do next. Should they stay in the house? Should they move? What about school and the scholarship? And what if people found out about their newfound wealth? The last thing she wanted was for Rachel and the other kids at school to use it against her. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Jessica tried to maintain some sense of normalcy, but the knowledge of their father's hidden wealth was always there, lurking in the back of her mind. She went back to school, trying to focus on her classes, but her heart wasn't in it. She found herself daydreaming, wondering what her father would say if he were still alive. Would he be proud of her for how she was handling everything? Or would he be disappointed that she still hadn't figured out what to do? One afternoon, as she walked through the school hallways, she noticed the familiar sneers of Rachel and her group. They were standing by the lockers, as usual, whispering and laughing about something. Jessica lowered her head, hoping to avoid their attention, but Rachel spotted her. "Well, if it isn't Miss Harvard," Rachel called out, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Still trying to make us believe you're going to get out of here with that fancy scholarship." Jessica clenched her fists, but kept walking. She didn't have the energy for a confrontation, especially not today. "I heard your dad's dead," Rachel continued, her voice growing louder as Jessica tried to walk away. "That sucks, doesn't it? Guess that scholarship's all you've got now." Jessica froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned slowly, meeting Rachel's eyes. For a moment, the hallway seemed to close in around her, the weight of Rachel's words crashing down on her like a wave. "What did you say?" Jessica asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel smirked, shrugging her shoulders. "Just saying it must be tough, you know, losing your dad and all, but at least you've got that Harvard thing to look forward to, right?" The anger that had been simmering inside Jessica for days finally bubbled to the surface. Without thinking, she stepped toward Rachel, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. "You don't know anything about my life," Jessica said through gritted teeth. "You think money and scholarships are what matters. You think that's what makes a person's life worth something." Rachel's smirk faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms in front of her chest. "I don't know, Jessica. Why else would you be so obsessed with going to Harvard? Isn't that what people like you dream of?" "People like me," Jessica repeated, her voice shaking with rage. "You think because I didn't grow up with the same clothes, the same phones, or the same vacations as you, that I'm less than you. You think that because my dad's gone, I'm broken." Rachel blinked, surprised by Jessica's intensity. The other students in the hallway had fallen silent, watching the confrontation unfold. "You don't get it," Jessica continued, her voice rising. "You don't understand what it's like to lose someone who was your whole world. You don't understand what it's like to fight every day just to keep going. But I'm still here. I'm still standing. And I'm going to Harvard because I earned it, not because I want to prove anything to you." For a moment, Rachel said nothing, her smug expression fading as she stared at Jessica in stunned silence. The hallway felt eerily quiet, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Without another word, Jessica turned and walked away, her heart racing. She didn't care if Rachel had more to say. She didn't care about the whispers that followed her as she made her way to her next class. All that mattered was that, for the first time in a long time, she had stood up for herself, and it felt good. Later that evening, back at home, Jessica sat down with Sophie in the living room. They had a lot to figure out, but for the first time, Jessica felt like they could do it. The money wasn't what defined them, and it wasn't what was going to save them. What mattered most was that they had each other, and they had their father's love, even if he was no longer with them. "Are you okay, Jess?" Sophie asked, her voice soft. Jessica nodded, smiling gently. "Yeah, Soph, I think I'm going to be okay. The days after Jessica's confrontation with Rachel felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a new sense of resolve that had settled in her heart. For the first time in weeks, Jessica felt like she had regained a small piece of control over her life. She had spoken her truth, faced her fears, and stood her ground. But despite the brief victory, the weight of everything she and Sophie were facing still loomed large. Especially now, with the inheritance hanging over them. Back at home, Jessica found herself constantly thinking about the decision she needed to make. It wasn't just about what to do with the money. They were faced with deeper questions. Would they stay in the same house, the one filled with memories of their father? Or would they move to a new place where they could start fresh? Should Jessica still go to Harvard, now that she had the financial means to support them? Or should she stay close to Sophie and take care of things here? That evening, as Jessica sat on the living room couch with Sophie, the weight of the decisions finally came to the surface. Sophie was sitting across from her, drawing in one of her new sketchbooks, but Jessica could see that something was on her mind. "Soph, is everything okay?" Jessica asked gently, breaking the silence. Sophie paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. "I was just thinking," she began slowly, as if unsure how to voice her thoughts. "Now that we have all this money, does that mean we're moving? Are we going to live somewhere else?" Jessica bit her lip, unsure how to answer. "I don't know, Soph. I haven't decided yet." Sophie frowned, looking down at her drawing. "I don't want to leave, Jess. This is where we lived with Dad. I don't want to leave all the memories behind." Jessica felt her chest tighten. She understood exactly what Sophie was feeling. This house, despite its flaws, was their home. It held the echoes of their father's laughter, the warmth of family dinners, and the comfort of knowing he had always been there for them. Moving away felt like leaving all of that behind, like closing a door on the life they had shared. "I know, Soph," Jessica said softly, "but we also need to think about what's best for us now. Dad wanted us to be okay, to have a good life. Maybe a new place could help us start fresh." Sophie's eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if we forget him? What if it feels like we're trying to forget everything?" Jessica reached out and took Sophie's hand. "We'll never forget him. No matter where we live, Dad will always be with us, in our hearts, in our memories. He's a part of us, no matter what." Sophie nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. "I guess it just feels like everything's changing so fast." Jessica understood that feeling all too well. The inheritance had turned their world upside down, and while it provided financial security, it also brought new challenges. How would they handle the money? And more importantly, how would they handle the inevitable conflicts that might arise between them? As if on cue, Sophie asked the question that had been lingering between them for days. "Do we have to spend the money, Jess? Can't we just leave things the way they are?" Jessica sighed. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. The money, it's a lot of responsibility. We could use it to make things better for us, but we have to be smart about it." Sophie looked down again, her brow furrowed in thought. "But I don't want us to change. I don't want you to leave for college and forget about me." Jessica's heart ached at Sophie's words. She had known that Sophie was worried about her going to Harvard, but hearing it said out loud made the fear feel more real. "I'm not going to forget about you, Soph," Jessica said firmly. "You're the most important person in my life. No amount of money or college or anything else is going to change that." Sophie didn't seem entirely convinced. "But what if you go to Harvard and things are different? What if I'm here by myself?" Jessica leaned in closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You won't be by yourself, Sophie. I'll always be there for you, no matter where I am. And besides, you'll come visit me at Harvard. We'll figure it all out together." For a moment, Sophie looked unsure, but then she gave a small nod, trusting Jessica's words. "Okay," she whispered, "but promise me, we won't do anything crazy with the money. I don't want people to treat us differently." Jessica smiled softly, understanding exactly what Sophie meant. The money could easily change things between them and the people around them. It could bring unwanted attention, jealousy, or even resentment, and that was the last thing either of them wanted. "I promise," Jessica said. "We'll be smart about it." The next morning, Jessica woke up feeling more determined. She knew it was time to start making decisions about their future. After making breakfast for Sophie, she sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook, determined to lay out a plan. As she wrote, her mind buzzed with possibilities: investments, savings for Sophie's future, repairs for the house, and maybe even a small fund for emergencies. But the one thing she kept coming back to was Harvard. The scholarship had been her ticket out, a chance to build a life that would lift her and Sophie out of the struggle they had known for so long. But now, with the inheritance, the equation had changed. She didn't need the scholarship anymore. She had the financial means to support them, to stay close to Sophie and take care of things at home. But was that what their father would have wanted? Jessica knew her father had always dreamed of a better life for her, of seeing her achieve the things he hadn't been able to. He had wanted her to chase her dreams, to go to college, to create a future filled with opportunities. Could she walk away from that now, just because the money was there? As she sat at the table, lost in thought, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from Mr. Morgan, their lawyer. "Mr. Morgan, just checking in to see how you and Sophie are doing. I also wanted to remind you that we'll need to meet again soon to finalize some of the estate details. Let me know when you're available." Jessica stared at the message, the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders again. There were so many details to handle, so many decisions to make, but she couldn't put it off any longer. It was time to face the reality of their new lives. She replied to Mr. Morgan, setting up a meeting for later in the week. As she hit send, she felt a mix of emotions: anxiety, fear, but also a strange sense of hope. This inheritance, as complicated as it was, could be the key to building a new life for them. A life where they didn't have to worry about bills or food or school supplies. A life where Sophie could grow up feeling secure, and where Jessica could pursue her dreams without the weight of financial burden holding her back. But with that hope came the fear of losing themselves in the process. Their father had always kept them grounded, had always taught them that money wasn't what made life meaningful. And now, it was up to Jessica to make sure they didn't lose sight of that. As the day wore on, Jessica couldn't help but feel a growing tension between her and Sophie. Though they hadn't argued, there was an unspoken conflict between them. Sophie's fear of change, of losing the life they had known, and Jessica's sense of duty to make the most of what their father had left them. It was a delicate balance, one that Jessica wasn't sure she knew how to navigate. That night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Jessica realized that their father's legacy wasn't just about the money. It was about the lessons he had taught them, the values he had instilled in them. And as long as they remembered that, they would be okay. They had to be. The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension that Jessica hadn't expected. She and Sophie had always been close, bound by their shared experiences and the comfort of knowing they could rely on each other. But now, the weight of their father's inheritance was creating a rift between them, one that neither of them knew how to bridge. Jessica had been spending her days planning, meeting with Mr. Morgan, and figuring out how best to manage the money. She had opened a savings account, started looking into investments, and even began repairs on their old house. Everything was moving forward, but it wasn't without a cost. Sophie, once so eager to talk to Jessica about everything, had grown more distant. She spent more time in her room, drawing or watching TV, and when they did talk, their conversations were short, strained. One evening, after a particularly long day, Jessica decided it was time to confront the issue head-on. She found Sophie sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, watching a rerun of an old cartoon they used to watch together. The sight of her younger sister, looking so small and fragile, tugged at Jessica's heart. "Soph," Jessica said softly as she sat down beside her, can we talk for a minute? Sophie didn't look away from the TV, but she nodded slightly. I guess. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I know things have been weird lately, and I know a lot has changed, but I want us to talk about it so we don't keep feeling this way. Sophie finally turned her head to look at Jessica, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and frustration. It's not just the money, Jess. It's everything. You're different. Ever since we found out about the inheritance, it's like you're more focused on that than on us. On me. Jessica felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't realized how much her focus on the inheritance had affected Sophie. I'm sorry, Soph. I didn't mean to make you feel like that. It's just, there's so much to figure out, and I'm trying to make sure we're okay. Sophie shrugged, her voice quiet. I don't care about the money. I just miss the way things used to be, when it was just us and Dad, when we didn't have to think about all this stuff. Jessica nodded, understanding exactly what Sophie meant. I miss that too, she admitted. I miss Dad every day. But I don't think he would have wanted us to stay stuck in the past, Soph. He wanted us to have a future, a good one. That's why he left us the money. Sophie was quiet for a moment, staring at the screen. I know, but it feels like everything's changing too fast. Like we're losing everything that made us who we were. Jessica felt her heart ache at Sophie's words. She had been so focused on planning for the future that she hadn't stopped to think about what Sophie might be losing in the process. Their sense of home, the connection to their father, the simple life they had always known. I don't want us to lose who we are, Jessica said softly, reaching for Sophie's hand. And I don't want to make you feel like I'm leaving you behind. I promise, I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. Sophie looked down at their joined hands, her expression softening. I just don't want things to change so much that we forget Dad or us. Jessica squeezed Sophie's hand gently. We won't, I promise. We'll figure out how to keep moving forward, but we'll always hold on to Dad, and we'll always be us, no matter what. Sophie didn't say anything for a while, but when she finally spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. I'm scared, Jess. I'm scared of what's going to happen next. Jessica pulled Sophie into a hug, holding her tightly. I am too, Soph, but we'll get through it together. Despite their conversation, the tension between them didn't fully disappear. Sophie had agreed to let Jessica handle the financial decisions, but the growing distance between them was still there. Like a silent wall, neither of them knew how to tear down. As the weeks passed, Jessica found herself struggling to balance everything, managing the inheritance, keeping up with school, and making sure Sophie felt cared for. The strain was beginning to show, and no matter how hard she tried, Jessica couldn't seem to shake the feeling that she was failing in some way. One afternoon, after returning from a meeting with Mr. Morgan, Jessica found Sophie sitting on the front porch, drawing in her sketchbook. It was something she did when she needed to clear her mind, but today there was a tension in the air that Jessica couldn't ignore. Hey, Jessica said, sitting down beside her. How's the drawing going? Sophie glanced up, then back down at her sketchbook. It's fine, Jessica frowned, sensing that something was off. What's wrong? Sophie didn't answer at first, but after a moment, she closed her sketchbook and looked out at the street. Some of the kids at school found out about the money. Jessica's heart sank. What? How? Sophie shrugged. I don't know. I didn't tell anyone, but I guess word got out. Now they're acting weird around me, asking me if we're rich now, if I'm going to start buying fancy things. Her voice cracked slightly. I don't like it, Jess. I don't want them to treat me differently. Jessica felt a wave of guilt wash over her. This was exactly what she had feared, that the money would change things, that it would make people look at them differently. She had tried to keep the inheritance quiet, but in a small town, secrets never stayed hidden for long. I'm sorry, Soph, Jessica said, her voice filled with regret. I didn't want this to happen. I wanted us to keep living our lives without everything changing. Sophie shook her head, her eyes filled with frustration. But everything is changing, Jess. You're busy all the time. We're talking about moving, and now everyone at school is treating me like I'm some kind of rich kid. I hate it. Jessica reached out, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. I hate it too, Soph, but we're still us. We're still the same people we were before all of this. We just have to figure out how to handle it. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Jessica saw just how much her little sister was struggling. Sophie was still grieving their father, still trying to make sense of the world without him. And now she had to deal with the added pressure of people treating her differently because of the money. I don't want people to look at us like we're different, Sophie whispered. I just want things to go back to the way they were. Jessica felt her heart break for her sister. She wanted to make everything better, to take away Sophie's pain and confusion. But there was no easy fix. They couldn't go back to the way things were. Their father was gone, and their lives had changed in ways they couldn't undo. I know, Jessica said softly, pulling Sophie into a hug. I know you miss the way things were. I do too, but we can't go back. All we can do is move forward, and we'll do it together, okay? Sophie nodded against Jessica's shoulder, her small body trembling with emotion. I just don't want us to lose each other, she whispered. Jessica tightened her embrace, her own tears threatening to spill over. We won't, Soph, I promise. No matter what happens, we'll always have each other. As the weeks wore on, Jessica and Sophie did their best to adjust to their new reality. Jessica continued to manage the finances, making decisions with careful consideration for their future, while Sophie tried to navigate the complexities of school and friendships in the wake of the inheritance. But despite their best efforts, the tension between them remained. One night, as Jessica lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She had been so focused on managing the money and ensuring their financial security that she hadn't taken the time to truly grieve, to let herself feel the full weight of losing their father. And in doing so, she had distanced herself from Sophie, the one person who needed her the most. The next morning, Jessica made a decision. It was time to slow down, to take a step back from the financial decisions and focus on what really mattered, her relationship with Sophie. The money could wait. They needed each other more than anything right now. Jessica walked into Sophie's room, where she found her sister sitting at her desk, working on her homework. Hey, Soph, Jessica said softly, do you want to take a break and go for a walk with me? Just the two of us? Sophie looked up, surprised. Really? Yeah, Jessica said with a smile. I think we both need it. Sophie's face lit up, and for the first time in weeks, Jessica saw a glimpse of the old Sophie, the one who used to laugh easily and look at the world with wonder. As they walked through their neighborhood, the cool evening breeze brushing against their skin, Jessica realized that this was what they needed. Not money, not plans for the future, just time together. Time to heal, time to remember who they were, and time to rebuild the bond that had always kept them strong. The walk Jessica and Sophie shared helped ease some of the tension that had built between them, but it was clear that the cracks in their relationship had not fully healed. As much as they tried to return to their old dynamic, the weight of their new reality still lingered like an unwelcome guest. Jessica had hoped that spending more time with Sophie would bridge the gap that had grown between them, but as the days passed, she realized that the problems ran deeper than she had initially thought. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Sophie's usual quietness gave way to something more. Jessica had made an effort to cook one of their father's favorite meals, spaghetti and meatballs, hoping to bring some sense of normalcy back to their lives. But as they ate, the silence between them became more pronounced. Sophie, you've barely touched your food, Jessica said gently, trying to keep her tone light. Is everything okay? Sophie pushed her food around her plate, her eyes downcast. I don't know, Jess. I guess I'm just not hungry. Jessica frowned. You've been like this for a while now. If something's bothering you, you can talk to me, you know. For a moment, Sophie didn't respond. Then with a deep breath, she finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. It's not just one thing, Jess. It's everything. It's like nothing feels right anymore. I don't like the way people treat me at school. I don't like the way things are changing. Jessica's heart sank. She had known Sophie was struggling, but hearing her sister say it out loud made it all the more real. "I know things have been hard," Jessica said softly, "but I'm trying to make things better for us. I just need you to trust me." Sophie shook her head, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's not about trust, Jess. It's about feeling like everything's out of control. I didn't ask for any of this. The money, the attention, people treating us differently. I just want things to go back to how they were before Dad died." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. "I miss him too, Soph, every day. But we can't go back. We have to figure out how to move forward." Sophie's voice cracked. "I don't want to move forward if it means everything changes. I don't want to be rich. I don't want people looking at us like we're different. I just want Dad back." The pain in Sophie's voice cut through Jessica like a knife. She had been so focused on managing the money and planning for their future that she hadn't fully grasped how deeply Sophie was grieving. Her little sister wasn't just mourning their father. She was mourning the life they had lost. Jessica stood up from the table and walked around to Sophie, kneeling beside her chair. She reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry, Soph. I've been so caught up in everything that I didn't stop to think about how hard this has been for you. I've been trying to take care of things, but maybe I've been doing it the wrong way." Sophie wiped her eyes, sniffling as she looked at Jessica. "It just feels like we're drifting apart, Jess. Like you're focused on the money and the future, and I'm stuck in the past." Jessica's chest tightened with guilt. She hadn't realized how much her attempts to take charge had alienated Sophie. "We don't have to make any big decisions right now," Jessica said softly. "We'll take it one step at a time, and I'll make sure we're doing it together, okay?" Sophie nodded, though the sadness in her eyes remained. "I don't want to lose you too, Jess." "You won't," Jessica promised. "No matter what happens, we'll always have each other." In the days that followed, Jessica made a conscious effort to slow down. She took a break from meetings with Mr. Morgan and put the financial planning on hold. Instead, she focused on spending more time with Sophie, trying to rebuild the connection they had always shared. They went on more walks, watched movies together, and talked late into the night about their memories of their father. It wasn't a perfect solution. Sophie was still grieving, and Jessica was still wrestling with the responsibility of the inheritance. But it felt like they were beginning to find their way back to each other. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Sophie brought up a topic that had been weighing on both of their minds: Harvard. "Are you still going to go?" Sophie asked quietly, her voice hesitant. Jessica had been thinking about it a lot. The scholarship had been her dream, the chance to escape their small town and build a future she could be proud of. But now, with their father gone and the inheritance complicating things, she wasn't sure what the right choice was anymore. "I don't know," Jessica admitted. "I've been thinking about staying here for a while, making sure we're both okay before I make any decisions." Sophie's expression was hard to read. "But Harvard was your dream, Jess. You've worked so hard for it. Don't you want to go?" Jessica looked out at the quiet street, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "Of course I want to go, but things are different now. I don't want to leave you, especially after everything that's happened." Sophie was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. "I don't want you to give up your dream because of me." Jessica turned to her sister, surprised by the maturity in her words. "Sophie, I'm serious," Sophie said, her voice steady. "Dad always told you how proud he was of you and how much he wanted you to go to Harvard. He'd be so upset if you gave that up." Jessica swallowed hard, her eyes stinging with tears. "But what about you, Soph? I can't just leave you here alone." Sophie smiled sadly. "I won't be alone. I have friends, and I have school, and we can visit each other all the time, right?" Jessica nodded, though the thought of being so far away from Sophie made her heart ache. "Yeah, we'll visit, but it's still a big decision. I don't want to rush into it." Sophie leaned her head on Jessica's shoulder, her voice soft. "Whatever you decide, Jess, I'll support you. I just don't want you to lose sight of what you've always wanted." Jessica wrapped an arm around her sister, pulling her close. "Thank you, Soph. That means a lot." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the tension between them slowly fading. For the first time in weeks, Jessica felt like they were on the same page, like they were moving toward healing together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there were still many difficult decisions ahead, but at least they had each other. As the days turned into weeks, the pressure of the inheritance seemed to lessen. Jessica and Sophie were learning to navigate their new reality, finding small moments of peace in the chaos of their grief. They still had their bad days, days when the loss of their father felt too heavy to bear, but they were beginning to see a path forward. One evening, after another long day of school and homework, Jessica sat down with Sophie to revisit a question that had been hanging in the air since their father's passing: what to do about the house. "I've been thinking," Jessica said carefully, "about what Dad would want us to do. And I think he'd want us to make the best decision for our future. But I also know how much this house means to us." Sophie looked up from her drawing, her expression thoughtful. "I don't want to leave the house, Jess." "Not yet," Jessica nodded. "I don't think I'm ready to leave it either. We have so many memories here. But maybe we could make some updates, fix it up a little. That way, it feels more like ours." Sophie smiled faintly. "Yeah, I'd like that." Jessica felt a wave of relief. It wasn't a final decision, but it was a step in the right direction. They were rebuilding their lives, one day at a time, and as long as they had each other, they would be okay. Despite the calm that had settled between Jessica and Sophie in the days following their decision to stay in the house, Jessica could feel an undercurrent of tension growing between them. They had made the choice to stay for now, but the uncertainty about their future remained. Jessica had put off making any final decisions about Harvard, and although Sophie said she supported whatever Jessica wanted to do, there was something about her sister's quiet demeanor that suggested otherwise. It wasn't until one afternoon, while they were both sitting in the living room, that the unspoken tension finally boiled over. Jessica was at the table, looking over the details of their father's estate again, trying to make sense of all the legal documents. She had been doing this almost every day, meticulously going over the numbers, the property details, and the investments, feeling the pressure of making the right choices. Sophie, meanwhile, sat on the couch, flipping through one of her favorite sketchbooks, but she wasn't drawing. Jessica could tell by the way her sister's pencil hovered over the page, never touching it, that something was bothering her. "Soph," Jessica asked gently, looking up from the documents, "is everything okay?" Sophie didn't look up from her sketchbook. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice flat. Jessica sighed, setting the papers down. "Come on, I know when something's wrong. Talk to me." Sophie's pencil finally dropped, and she looked up, her face flushed with frustration. "It's just, you're always busy with those stupid papers, Jess. It's like you're obsessed with the money and the house and making decisions, and you don't even care about what's happening right now." Jessica was taken aback. She had been expecting some frustration, but not this level of anger. "That's not true, Soph. I do care. I'm trying to make sure we're okay." "Yeah, but you're not okay," Sophie snapped, her voice rising. "You're stressed all the time, and you're always looking at those papers like they're more important than anything else. I miss how things used to be, when we didn't have to worry about all this money stuff." Jessica's heart sank. She hadn't realized just how much her behavior was affecting Sophie. She had thought she was doing the right thing by focusing on their future, by trying to manage everything, but in doing so, she had neglected the present, their relationship, their bond. "I'm sorry, Soph," Jessica said quietly. "I didn't mean to make you feel like I don't care about us. I'm just trying to figure everything out. It's a lot of responsibility." Sophie stood up from the couch, pacing the room. "But maybe you don't need to figure everything out right now. Maybe we can just take a break from all of this. You don't have to make every decision today, Jess. I don't care about the money. I just want you to be my sister again." The words hit Jessica like a punch to the gut. Sophie wasn't wrong. She had been consumed by the details of the estate, by the pressure of making sure they didn't make any mistakes. but she hadn't realized how much it was pulling her away from the one person who needed her most. "I didn't know you felt like that," Jessica admitted, her voice soft. "I've been so focused on the future that I haven't been here for you in the way I should." Sophie stopped pacing and looked at Jessica, her expression softening just a little. "It's not just about me, Jess. You're not here for yourself either. You're always worrying. You don't smile like you used to. It's like you're carrying the world on your shoulders." Jessica swallowed hard, her chest tightening with guilt. She hadn't wanted Sophie to feel this way. She had promised herself she would take care of her sister, that she wouldn't let the inheritance or the grief consume them, but it was clear that she had been failing. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Sophie crossed the room and sat down next to Jessica, her voice quiet but firm. "I know you're doing your best, but we can't live like this forever. Dad wouldn't want us to be stuck in the past or obsessed with money. He'd want us to live our lives." Jessica nodded, wiping at her eyes. "You're right. I've been so afraid of making a mistake that I haven't been living at all. And I haven't been there for you the way I promised I would be." Sophie rested her head on Jessica's shoulder, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to dissolve. But Jessica knew that they weren't done talking yet. There was still the question of Harvard, of what the future held for both of them. "Soph," Jessica began hesitantly, "what do you think about me going to Harvard?" Sophie didn't lift her head from Jessica's shoulder. "I don't want you to go, Jess. I'm scared of being here without you." Jessica's heart clenched. This was what she had feared the most, that Sophie, despite her brave front, was terrified of being left behind. "I don't want to leave you," Jessica said softly, "but I also don't want to give up on my dreams. I just don't know how to do both." Sophie finally sat up, looking at Jessica with a serious expression. "You shouldn't give up your dreams, Jess, but maybe we can find a way to make it work. Maybe you don't have to go right away. You could take a gap year or something. Stay here for a little while longer until we figure things out." Jessica thought about it for a moment. A gap year. She hadn't considered it before, but it made sense. It would give them both more time to adjust to their new reality, to grieve and heal, and it would give her more time with Sophie to make sure her sister was okay before taking that big step toward her future. "That's actually a really good idea," Jessica said, surprised by the relief that washed over her. "I hadn't thought about taking a year off, but maybe that's exactly what we need. We can figure out the money, the house, everything together." Sophie nodded, her expression softening. "Yeah, together." That evening, as Jessica lay in bed, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't consumed by the weight of the estate or the pressure to make every decision immediately. She realized that she didn't have to have all the answers right away. It was okay to take things one day at a time, to give herself and Sophie the space to heal and grow. The next morning, Jessica made a phone call to Mr. Morgan. She explained her decision to take a break from the estate planning, to hold off on any major financial decisions until she and Sophie were ready. Mr. Morgan was understanding, reassuring her that there was no rush and that they could revisit everything when the time felt right. For the first time in weeks, Jessica felt like she could breathe again. As the days passed, Jessica and Sophie began to find a new rhythm. They spent more time together, going on walks, watching movies, and talking about their father. Jessica no longer felt the pressure to constantly manage the estate or plan for the future. Instead, she focused on being present for Sophie, on rebuilding their relationship and giving them both the time and space they needed. They hadn't made any final decisions about Harvard or the house, but for now, that was okay. They had time. And for the first time since their father's death, Jessica felt like they were going to be okay. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, Sophie turned to Jessica and smiled. "I'm glad we're doing this, Jess. I'm glad we're figuring it out together." Jessica smiled back, feeling a warmth in her chest. "Me too, Soph. Me too." Jessica had always prided herself on being independent. Ever since their father's death, she had shouldered most of the responsibility, determined to protect Sophie and manage the complexities of their inheritance on her own. But as the weeks wore on, it became clear that she couldn't do it all by herself. The weight of everything was too much to carry alone, and she realized she needed help that extended beyond her and Sophie's bond. That afternoon, after making the decision to take a gap year, Jessica sat on her bed, staring at her phone. She had distanced herself from most of her friends over the last few months, too caught up in her own world of grief and financial stress to stay in touch. But now, she felt the urge to reach out. She needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't family. She scrolled through her contacts, hesitating for a moment before landing on Evan's name. Evan had always been a good friend, steady, reliable, and understanding. They had bonded over their love for science and math in school, and though they weren't incredibly close, Jessica knew he would listen. She took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before Evan picked up. "Hey, Jess, long time no talk. What's up?" Hearing his friendly voice brought an unexpected sense of relief. "Hey, Evan, I know it's been a while. I kinda needed to talk." There was a brief pause on the other end before Evan responded, his tone more serious now. "Of course, I'm all ears. How are you holding up?" Jessica sighed, trying to find the right words. "It's been hard, really hard. I thought I could handle everything after my dad died. The money, Sophie, school, but I've realized I'm drowning in it all. I feel like I'm losing myself in the process." "I get that," Evan said softly. "It's a lot for anyone to deal with, especially someone our age. You don't have to do it all alone, Jess." "I know," Jessica admitted, "but I didn't want to burden anyone else. It felt like it was my responsibility to take care of everything." Evan's voice was filled with compassion. "Taking care of Sophie and managing your dad's estate doesn't mean you have to shut everyone out. You have people who care about you, Jess. People who want to help." Jessica blinked back tears, grateful for his words. "I guess I've just been too afraid to ask for help. I didn't know how." "Well, you're asking now, and that's what matters," Evan said. "You've been through a lot, and it's okay to lean on others. Have you talked to anyone else about how you're feeling?" Jessica hesitated. "Not really. Sophie and I talk, but I don't want to put too much on her. She's going through her own stuff." "Yeah, but you both need support," Evan pointed out. "Maybe it's time to reconnect with your friends. We're here for you, Jess, and it might help to have some people around who can remind you that you don't have to go through this alone." Jessica felt a small spark of hope. "Maybe you're right. It's just, I've been so focused on the future, on making sure everything is perfect, that I've forgotten how to just live." "Then start small," Evan suggested. "We can hang out sometime, catch up. Or I can come over if you don't feel like going anywhere. No pressure." Jessica smiled for the first time in what felt like days. "I'd like that." The following weekend, Evan stopped by the house, bringing a pizza and a couple of movies. It wasn't a big event, just the two of them hanging out in the living room while Sophie stayed upstairs, drawing in her room. But it was exactly what Jessica needed. The weight on her chest seemed to lift as they talked about everything but the serious stuff. For the first time in a long time, she felt like a normal teenager, laughing and joking around without the heavy cloud of grief hovering over her. "You know," Evan said between bites of pizza, "I've always admired how strong you are, Jess. But it's okay to not be strong all the time." Jessica paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I don't feel strong, Evan. Most days, I feel like I'm barely holding it together." "That's because you're human," he replied. "You're not supposed to have all the answers, and it's okay to lean on your friends. That's what we're here for." Jessica looked down, overwhelmed by his kindness. "I guess I've been afraid to admit that I can't do it all on my own." Evan smiled gently. "Well, now you don't have to. You've got me. And I'm sure there are others who'd be more than happy to help if you let them in." Jessica nodded, feeling the walls she had built around herself begin to crumble. "Thanks, Evan. I didn't realize how much I needed this." "Any time," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. Over the next few weeks, Jessica slowly started to open up more. She reached out to her other friends, reconnecting with the people she had once been close to, but had pulled away from after her father's death. It was awkward at first. She wasn't used to being vulnerable, but the more she shared, the more she realized how much support she had been missing. Her friends rallied around her, offering to help with everything from watching Sophie when Jessica needed a break to giving her advice about how to manage the estate. It wasn't that they had all the answers, but knowing that they were there made a world of difference. Sophie, too, seemed to benefit from the presence of Jessica's friends. She wasn't as withdrawn anymore, and on more than one occasion, Jessica caught her chatting with Evan or laughing along with some of her other friends who came over to visit. It was like a weight had been lifted off both of them. One afternoon, after Evan had left and Sophie had gone upstairs to work on a school project, Jessica sat in the kitchen, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. For so long, she had believed that she needed to handle everything on her own, but now she understood that she didn't have to. She had a support system, people who genuinely cared about her and Sophie, and that made all the difference. As she sipped her tea, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Morgan, reminding her that they needed to meet again soon to finalize some of the estate decisions. Normally, the thought of another meeting would have filled her with anxiety, but now she felt more confident. She wasn't alone anymore. She had people she could turn to, and that made the future seem a little less daunting. With a newfound sense of resolve, Jessica replied to Mr. Morgan, setting up the meeting for later that week. This time, she would go into it with a clear head and a lighter heart. The next day, as Jessica and Sophie sat together on the porch, enjoying the late afternoon sun, Sophie turned to her and smiled. "You seem happier, Jess, like you're not so stressed anymore." Jessica nodded, feeling the truth of Sophie's words. "I think I'm learning how to ask for help, and that's made everything feel a little easier." Sophie grinned. "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Jess." Jessica reached out and squeezed Sophie's hand, grateful for the bond they had. "We both do, Soph, and we're going to be okay. I can feel it." Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with a quiet confidence. "Yeah, we will." As they sat together watching the world around them, Jessica felt a deep sense of peace. There were still challenges ahead, still decisions to be made, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She knew that with the support of her friends and the love of her sister, she could face whatever came next. And that was all that mattered. The weeks leading up to Sophie's birthday were filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. It was the first time in months that Jessica felt a real reason to celebrate something, a small glimmer of joy in the middle of everything they had been through. Despite the ongoing grief and challenges, Sophie's birthday seemed like the perfect opportunity to create a moment of happiness for both of them. Jessica decided to keep the celebration simple but meaningful. They hadn't done anything big since their father passed, and she wanted to respect that their emotions were still raw. But she also knew that Sophie needed a day to feel special, to be reminded that life, even after all the loss, could still hold moments of joy. 2 days before Sophie's birthday, Jessica sat at the kitchen table, making a list of things to do. She had already ordered a small cake from their favorite bakery, the one their father used to take them to on special occasions. It wasn't extravagant, just a simple chocolate cake with Sophie's favorite vanilla buttercream frosting. She planned to invite a few of Sophie's closest friends over for a quiet celebration at the house. As she worked on her list, Jessica's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Evan. "Evan, hey, do you need any help with Sophie's birthday? I can come early to set things up or bring something if you want." Jessica smiled, grateful for the offer. She had gotten closer to Evan over the past few weeks, and his presence had become a comforting constant in her life. His willingness to help was a reminder that she didn't have to do everything alone anymore. "Jessica, thanks, Evan. I think I've got most of it covered, but you can definitely come early to help me set up. It would be nice to have you here. Evan, you got it. I'll be there around noon. With that taken care of, Jessica felt a bit more relaxed. She glanced up to see Sophie coming into the kitchen, her eyes lighting up when she saw the list. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked, leaning over Jessica's shoulder. "Just planning a few things for your birthday," Jessica replied with a smile. "I thought we'd keep it small. Just a few friends, some cake, and maybe a movie night. Does that sound okay?" Sophie grinned. "That sounds perfect. Thanks, Jess." Jessica felt a surge of warmth at Sophie's excitement. It had been a while since she had seen her sister this happy. "I'm glad you like the plan," Jessica said. "We can make it a fun, low-key day, something that's just for you." Sophie nodded eagerly. "I can't wait." On the day of Sophie's birthday, the house buzzed with quiet excitement. Jessica had spent the morning tidying up and decorating the living room with a few streamers and balloons. Nothing too flashy, just enough to make it feel festive. Evan arrived right on time, carrying a gift bag with bright wrapping paper. "Hey, birthday planner extraordinaire," Evan said as he stepped inside, flashing a grin. "What's next on the to-do list?" Jessica laughed, handing him a string of balloons. "You can help me hang these up if you don't mind." As they worked together to finish the decorations, Jessica couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude for the people who had become part of her life. Evan, her friends, and Sophie's friends. All of them had been there when she needed them most. It wasn't just about the support, it was about knowing she didn't have to carry the burden of their loss alone. By the time Sophie's friends arrived in the early afternoon, the house was filled with laughter and conversation. The small group of kids gathered around the table, chatting excitedly as they waited for the cake. Jessica brought it out, lighting the candles as everyone gathered to sing "Happy Birthday." As the song came to an end, Sophie leaned over and closed her eyes, making a wish before blowing out the candles. The room erupted in applause, and for a moment, Jessica saw pure happiness in her sister's eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time. After cutting the cake and handing out slices, the group moved into the living room to watch a movie. Sophie's favorite animated film played on the TV, and the kids settled onto the couch with bowls of popcorn. Jessica sat in the kitchen with Evan, listening to the sound of their laughter drifting from the other room. "You did a great job with this," Evan said, taking a sip of soda. "Sophie looks really happy." Jessica smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "Thanks. I wanted to make it special for her. She deserves it after everything." Evan nodded thoughtfully. "You both do. It's good to see you smiling again, too." Jessica glanced at him, surprised by how much that simple statement meant to her. She had been so focused on taking care of Sophie that she hadn't stopped to think about her own happiness. But now, surrounded by friends and family, she realized that joy was still possible, even in the midst of grief. "I guess I forgot how to smile for a while," Jessica admitted. "But today feels different, like maybe things are starting to get better." "They are," Evan said quietly, "and they will keep getting better." One step at a time, Jessica nodded, feeling a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in months. The weight of their loss would always be there, but it didn't have to define every moment of their lives. There was still room for happiness, for laughter, and for celebration. As the evening wore on and Sophie's friends slowly left, Jessica and Evan began cleaning up the remnants of the party. Sophie had gone upstairs to open her presents in private, leaving the two of them alone in the kitchen. "Thanks for your help today," Jessica said, wiping down the counter. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Any time," Evan replied with a grin. "You know I'm always here if you need me." Jessica paused, looking at Evan with gratitude. "I really appreciate that, Evan. More than you know." He smiled, but there was something sincere and warm behind his eyes. "You don't have to do everything alone, Jess. You've got people who care about you." Jessica felt a warmth spread through her chest, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this journey. She had spent so much time trying to carry everything on her own that she had forgotten what it felt like to lean on others. But now, with Evan's support and the presence of her friends, she was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. After Evan left, Jessica went upstairs to check on Sophie. She found her sitting on her bed, surrounded by wrapping paper and birthday cards, her face glowing with happiness. "Hey, birthday girl," Jessica said, leaning against the doorframe. "Did you have a good day?" Sophie looked up, her smile wide. "It was perfect, Jess. Thank you for everything." Jessica walked over and sat beside her on the bed. "I'm glad you liked it. I just wanted you to have a day that was all about you." Sophie leaned her head on Jessica's shoulder, her voice soft. It was the best birthday ever. Jessica felt a rush of emotion as she wrapped her arm around her sister. It wasn't just about the party or the presents. It was about seeing Sophie truly happy, about feeling connected to her again after so many months of struggle. For the first time in a long time, they were both starting to heal. And as they sat together in the quiet of Sophie's room, Jessica knew that their father would have been proud of how far they had come, proud of the love they still shared, and proud of the fact that they were finding joy in the little moments again. The days following Sophie's birthday were filled with a renewed sense of hope. It felt like a turning point, a reminder that even after so much loss, they could still find happiness. Jessica had begun to ease into a new routine, one that balanced taking care of Sophie, managing their inheritance, and staying connected to her friends. She still wasn't entirely sure what the future held, but for now, they were both okay, and that was enough. One evening, after a particularly long day of school and errands, Jessica decided to spend some time going through their father's old belongings. It had been months since she had looked at any of his things, mostly because it hurt too much. But now, with her and Sophie finding their footing again, Jessica felt a strange sense of readiness. It was time to start sorting through their past. She made her way to the attic, where most of their father's things had been stored after the funeral. The small space was cluttered with boxes, filled with memories from their childhood, old photo albums, their father's favorite books, and some family mementos. Jessica carefully opened one of the boxes and began sifting through its contents, her heart heavy with nostalgia. As she pulled out a stack of old photos, her hand brushed against something unfamiliar. It was a small, unmarked box tucked in the corner. Curious, Jessica opened it and found an old camcorder inside, along with a few tapes. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what it was: her father's old video recorder. He had used it to film family vacations and holidays when she and Sophie were little. Jessica's heart raced as she fumbled with the camcorder, her hands shaking slightly. She hadn't watched any of their father's videos in years. In fact, she had forgotten they even existed. But now, holding the tapes in her hands, she felt an overwhelming urge to see him again, to hear his voice, to watch him smile. She grabbed the camcorder and one of the tapes, heading downstairs to the living room where Sophie was sitting on the couch, reading a book. "Hey, Soph," Jessica said, holding up the camcorder. "Look what I found." Sophie glanced up, her eyes widening in surprise. "Is that Dad's old camera?" Jessica nodded, sitting down beside her. "Yeah, I found a bunch of tapes in the attic. I was thinking maybe we could watch one." Sophie hesitated, her expression uncertain. "I don't know, Jess. Do you think we're ready for that?" Jessica understood her hesitation. The thought of seeing their father again, moving, talking, laughing, felt both comforting and painful. But at the same time, she knew it might be what they needed, a way to feel close to him again, even if just for a little while. "I think it might help," Jessica said softly. "We don't have to watch all of them, just one. If it's too much, we can stop." Sophie bit her lip, then nodded slowly. "Okay, let's try." Jessica smiled and inserted the tape into the camcorder, connecting it to the TV. As she pressed play, the screen flickered for a moment before coming to life with the familiar sound of their father's voice. The video was from one of their family vacations to the beach. Jessica, who had been around 10 years old at the time, was running along the shore with Sophie, their laughter ringing out across the waves. Their father's voice could be heard from behind the camera, narrating the scene with his usual warmth and humor. "There's my girls," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Look at them go. They're growing up so fast." Jessica's heart clenched as she watched the screen. Seeing herself and Sophie as carefree children, with their father's voice narrating their every move, felt like stepping into a time machine. It was a reminder of all the joy they had shared before everything had changed. Sophie, who had been silent at first, let out a small laugh as she watched the younger version of herself splash in the waves. "I remember that day," she said softly. "I didn't want to leave the beach, even after the sun went down." Jessica smiled, her eyes misting over. "Yeah, Dad had to carry you back to the car because you wouldn't stop playing in the sand." They continued watching the video, their father's voice guiding them through the memories. There were scenes of them building sand castles, eating ice cream, and sitting by the campfire, their father's laughter echoing in the background. For a brief moment, it felt like he was there with them again, just as he had always been. But as the video came to an end, the screen went black for a few seconds, and then something unexpected happened. Another clip began to play, but this time it wasn't from the beach vacation. It was much more recent. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the image of her father appeared on the screen, sitting in what looked like his home office. He wasn't filming anyone else. This video was just him, speaking directly into the camera. "Jess, Sophie," he began, his voice soft but steady. "If you're watching this, it means I'm not with you anymore. I'm sorry for that." Jessica's heart pounded in her chest as she realized what this was. It was a message their father had left for them, knowing that one day they would need to hear his words. "I know things are going to be hard," their father continued, his eyes filled with the same warmth and love they had always known. "Losing me, dealing with everything that comes after, it's a lot, and I wish I could be there to help you through it." Sophie let out a small gasp, her eyes wide as she clutched Jessica's arm. "Jess!" Jessica nodded, her own eyes filling with tears. "I know, Soph. I know." Their father took a deep breath on the screen, his expression becoming more serious. "But I want you both to know something. No matter what happens, no matter how hard things get, you have each other. That's the most important thing. Take care of each other, okay? Be there for one another, just like I've always tried to be there for you." Jessica wiped at her eyes, her chest tight with emotion. She could hear the weight in her father's voice, the knowledge that he wouldn't be around to see them grow up, to guide them through life's challenges. But even in this moment, he was still trying to protect them, to offer the wisdom he had always given so freely. "I'm proud of you both," their father said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're stronger than you know, and whatever you do with your lives, whatever paths you choose, I'll be with you. Always." The screen went black again, and for a moment, neither Jessica nor Sophie moved. They sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what they had just seen. It was Sophie who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know he made that." Jessica shook her head, her own voice thick with emotion. "Neither did I." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their father's words settling over them like a comforting blanket. It was as if he had reached out from beyond the grave to remind them of everything that truly mattered. The money, the decisions, the struggles, all of it paled in comparison to the love they shared as a family. "I miss him so much," Sophie whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jessica wrapped her arms around her sister, pulling her close. "I miss him too, Soph. Every day." But as they sat together, holding each other in the quiet of their living room, Jessica realized that their father had been right. They did have each other, and that was what would carry them through the hardest times. They had lost so much, but they hadn't lost everything. Their father's love, his guidance, and his memory were still with them, woven into the fabric of their lives. And with each other's support, they would continue to find their way forward. The discovery of the video left Jessica and Sophie shaken, but in the best way possible. Their father's message had given them something they didn't realize they needed: closure, guidance, and a final expression of his love. It was a bittersweet reminder that while he was gone, he had still found a way to be with them, to encourage them to keep moving forward. It brought them peace, even if the pain of losing him would always remain. The next morning, Jessica woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had spent months trying to figure out the right thing to do, whether to go to Harvard, what to do with the house, how to manage their father's estate. But now, after watching his video, things seemed clearer. It wasn't about making the perfect decision. It was about making the decision that felt right for them. Sophie was already downstairs, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, when Jessica joined her. They exchanged a quiet smile, both of them still processing everything they had seen and heard the night before. "Did you sleep okay?" Jessica asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Sophie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I did. I kept thinking about what Dad said, though, about taking care of each other." Jessica sat down across from her sister, stirring her coffee absently. "I've been thinking about that too. He was right. We need to be there for each other, no matter what." Sophie's gaze dropped to her cereal bowl. "Jess, I've been thinking a lot about what you said before, about Harvard." Jessica's stomach tightened. This was a conversation they had been avoiding for a while, ever since she had mentioned taking a gap year to stay with Sophie. The decision had been put on hold, but now it seemed like Sophie was ready to talk about it again. "What about it?" Jessica asked gently. Sophie hesitated for a moment, then looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I don't want you to give it up." Jessica blinked, caught off guard by her sister's words. "Soph, I told you, I'm not going to leave you here alone. I can take a year off and we can figure things out together." Sophie shook her head, her voice steady. "I don't need you to take a year off. I need you to do what Dad would have wanted you to do. He always talked about how proud he was of you, how much he wanted you to go to Harvard. I don't want you to throw that away because of me." Jessica felt a lump form in her throat. "Sophie, it's not because of you. It's because I want to make sure we're both okay. I don't want to leave you when we're still figuring everything out. But I don't want to hold you back," Sophie insisted, her voice cracking slightly. "I'll be okay, Jess. I've got friends, I've got school, and I've got Dad's words to remind me that we're going to be fine. You don't have to sacrifice your dreams for me." Jessica stared at her sister, overwhelmed by the maturity in her words. Sophie was only 12, but in that moment, she seemed so much older, so much more aware of the bigger picture than Jessica had given her credit for. "Are you sure?" Jessica asked softly, still struggling to wrap her head around the idea of leaving for Harvard. Sophie nodded firmly. "I'm sure. And besides, I can visit you there. It's not like you're going to another planet. We'll still be together, just in a different way." Jessica's heart swelled with emotion. For so long, she'd been worried about leaving Sophie behind, about the idea that pursuing her own dreams would mean abandoning her sister. But now, hearing Sophie's words, she realized that maybe her leaving for Harvard wouldn't be the disaster she had feared. Maybe it was just another step in their journey, one that they could navigate together, even from a distance. "I don't want to lose you, Soph," Jessica said quietly. "Not after everything we've been through." "You're not going to lose me," Sophie replied, her voice full of certainty. "We're sisters. We'll always be there for each other, no matter what." Jessica felt a tear slip down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness. It was from the overwhelming love she felt for her sister, the bond they shared that nothing, neither distance nor grief, could break. "Okay," Jessica said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll go to Harvard, but we'll make it work. We'll figure out a way to stay connected, and I'll come back whenever you need me. You'll never be alone." Sophie smiled, relief washing over her face. Deal. In the days that followed, Jessica and Sophie began to plan for the future with a new sense of clarity. Jessica called Mr. Morgan to finalize the estate planning, deciding to put the bulk of the inheritance into a trust that would be used for both their futures, her education, Sophie's schooling, and anything else they might need along the way. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about building a future that honored their father's memory while giving them the freedom to live their lives. The decision to keep the house came naturally. They had considered selling it and moving somewhere new, but after watching their father's video, it became clear that the house was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of their family, of the love and memories they had shared within its walls. It was a connection to their father that neither of them was ready to let go of. "We'll fix it up," Jessica said one afternoon as they sat on the front porch, looking out at the quiet street. "New paint, new windows, whatever it takes to make it feel like ours again?" Sophie nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and we can keep Dad's things too, his books, his photos. It'll be like he's still here with us." Jessica smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. Exactly. They spent the next few weeks preparing for the changes ahead. Jessica applied for her deferred admission to Harvard, and the acceptance letter came quickly, reaffirming her place in the incoming class. Sophie, meanwhile, started planning for the upcoming school year, excited about new classes and the projects she wanted to work on. The weight of uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose and hope for the future. But even as they moved forward, they didn't forget their father. His words, his love, and his memory were woven into everything they did. On quiet evenings, they would sometimes re-watch the video he had left for them, drawing comfort from the sound of his voice, from the knowledge that he was still with them in spirit. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching one of their father's old movies, Sophie turned to Jessica with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" she asked quietly. Jessica smiled, pulling Sophie close. "I know he would be. He already told us how proud he was, and I think he'd be even prouder of how we've handled everything." Sophie leaned her head on Jessica's shoulder, her voice soft. "I miss him, Jess." "I miss him too," Jessica whispered, her heart aching with the familiar pang of loss. "But we're going to be okay. We have each other, and we have his love." "That's enough," Sophie nodded, her eyes closing as she relaxed into Jessica's embrace. And for the first time in a long time, they both felt at peace, knowing that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Months had passed since Jessica and Sophie had made their decision to stay in the house and move forward with their lives. Spring had come, and with it, a renewed sense of hope and possibility. The trees lining their street were full of green leaves, and the air smelled fresh and new. Like a sign of the changes happening in their lives, the repairs on the house had begun, bringing a sense of rejuvenation to the place they had once feared might hold them back. New paint on the walls, updated fixtures, and fresh windows gave the home a brighter, more welcoming feel. But despite the changes, the essence of their father lingered in every room. His books still lined the shelves, his framed photographs hanging in the hallway, and his favorite chair still sitting by the window where he used to read. Jessica had made peace with the idea of leaving for Harvard. With Sophie's encouragement and their father's message still fresh in her heart, she knew it was the right decision. But rather than feeling the looming anxiety she once had about the future, Jessica now felt excitement. She had learned to let go of the fear of being apart from Sophie. They had built a strong foundation together, one that would hold them up, no matter the distance. One sunny afternoon, just a week before Jessica's move to Cambridge for the start of the fall semester, she and Sophie sat together on the back porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sky slowly turn pink as the sun began to set. "You're really going, huh?" Sophie said, her tone somewhere between teasing and wistful. Jessica smiled, glancing over at her sister. "Yeah, I really am. Can you believe it?" Sophie shrugged, though there was a proud glint in her eyes. "Honestly, I always knew you'd go. I think Dad did too." Jessica's heart swelled at the mention of their father. His presence still hung over them, not in a painful way anymore, but as a source of strength. "I think you're right. I've been thinking a lot about him lately. It's like he's been guiding me this whole time." Sophie nodded thoughtfully. "Me too. Sometimes I can almost hear his voice when I'm trying to make a decision, like he's giving me advice." Jessica smiled warmly, reaching over to squeeze Sophie's hand. "That's because he's always with us, Soph. He'll always be there when we need him." Sophie turned to her sister, her expression serious. "I'm going to miss you, Jess, but I'm really proud of you too. I know Harvard's your dream, and I'm glad you're going." Jessica felt a lump in her throat. "I'm going to miss you too, but we'll talk all the time, and I'll visit every chance I get." Sophie grinned. "You better, and don't worry about me. I'll be fine. I've got friends, school, and our home. You've done so much to make sure we're okay." Jessica blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the maturity in Sophie's words. "I'm so proud of you, Soph. You've grown up so much these last few months. You're stronger than you realize." Sophie's smile faltered for a moment as she looked down at her hands. "I didn't always feel strong, Jess. There were times when I was really scared, after Dad died, and even when we got the inheritance. It felt like everything was changing too fast, and I wasn't ready." Jessica's chest tightened as she remembered how hard those months had been for both of them. "I know. I was scared too. But we got through it together." Sophie nodded, her voice soft. "Yeah, we did, and now I feel like I'm ready for whatever comes next." Jessica smiled, pride swelling in her chest. Sophie had come so far since their father's death. She had faced her grief head-on and had learned how to navigate the uncertainties of life with grace and resilience. And Jessica, in turn, had learned that she didn't have to carry everything on her shoulders. They had leaned on each other, just like their father had told them to, and they had emerged stronger for it. The day of Jessica's departure came quickly. The car was packed with boxes and suitcases, and the trunk was filled with essentials for her dorm room at Harvard. Sophie stood in the driveway, watching as Jessica loaded the last of her things into the car. Evan had come to say goodbye as well, standing beside Sophie with a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He had been a steady presence in their lives, always there to lend a hand or offer support when they needed it most. "Are you sure you don't need me to drive up with you?" Evan asked, though his tone was light. Jessica shook her head with a smile. "I've got it covered. Besides, I'll only be a few hours away. I'm not disappearing." Evan nodded, though his smile was tinged with emotion. "Well, just know that we'll miss you around here." Jessica glanced between Evan and Sophie, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. "I'm going to miss you guys too, but I'll be back before you know it." She turned to Sophie, her heart heavy with the impending separation. "You sure you'll be okay, Soph?" Sophie nodded confidently. "I'm sure you've already set everything up for me, and I know what I'm doing. Plus, Evan's here if I need anything." Evan gave a playful salute. "You bet," Jessica chuckled, though her heart still ached. Leaving Sophie was going to be harder than she had anticipated, but she knew it was the right choice for both of them. They had come a long way since the chaos of their father's passing, and now it was time for them to start their new chapters. Jessica pulled Sophie into a tight hug, holding her close for a long moment. "I love you, Soph. You're going to do amazing things. I know it." Sophie hugged her back just as tightly. "I love you too, Jess, and I'll be cheering you on the whole time." When they finally pulled apart, Jessica wiped a tear from her eye and gave one last wave before climbing into the driver's seat. As she started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, she looked in the rearview mirror to see Sophie and Evan standing there, waving her off with smiles on their faces. A sense of peace settled over Jessica as she drove away, heading toward her future. The road ahead was filled with possibilities, but she no longer felt the uncertainty and fear that had once plagued her. She knew that no matter where life took her, she would always have a home to come back to, a home filled with love, memories, and the unbreakable bond she shared with her sister. And in the quiet moments, when the world seemed overwhelming, Jessica knew she would always hear her father's voice, reminding her that she was never truly alone. As the miles passed, Jessica couldn't help but feel that she was stepping into the next chapter of her life. A chapter that would be filled with new challenges, new opportunities, and new growth. But as she headed toward Harvard, she did so with a heart full of love and a deep sense of knowing who she was and where she came from. No matter how far she went, She would always carry her family with her father's love, Sophie's support, and the strength they had built together through the hardest of times. And that was all she needed. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.